Hey, what if I told you that one of history's most explosive uprisings wasn't started by generals, kings, or politicians, but by farmers who'd simply had enough? We're talking 1381, England. A moment when ordinary people looked up at the most powerful system on earth and said, actually, no, the Peasants' Revolt. And no, before you close this tab, this isn't your dusty textbook chapter. This is the story they buried. Think plagues, frozen wages, corrupt tax collectors showing up at your door, and a teenager sitting on the throne trying to hold it all together. Wild. Oh, it gets wilder. This is the hidden history of the people who built medieval England and then burned parts of it down when it stopped working for them. Before we dive in, drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching this? What time is it there? I genuinely want to know who's here for the chaos. Now get comfortable. Because we're going all the way back to 1381 and nothing about it is what you think. Here is something that history class almost never gets around to telling you. The story of 1381, the year England came closer to a genuine social revolution than at almost any other point in its entire medieval existence, is not really a story about kings. It is not a story about battles in the traditional sense, with cavalry charges and heraldic banners, and men in shining armour doing noble things on horseback. It is a story about people whose names were barely considered worth writing down, whose complaints were dismissed as noise, and whose world was so thoroughly controlled by those above them that even moving to the next village without permission was technically illegal. And then, one summer, they simply decided they had had enough. That decision shook the English ruling class so deeply that the trauma of it echoed through political debates for the next 2 centuries. Not bad for a group of people who were mostly just asking to be treated like human beings. But before we get to the burning and the marching and the extraordinary moment when a teenager on a horse faced down tens of thousands of furious rebels in a London field, we need to slow down and ask a question that sounds simple, but is actually anything but. Who exactly were these people? What did their lives actually look like before the moment everything exploded? Because if you walk into 1381 carrying the image most of us were handed in school dirty, helpless serfs hunched over muddy fields, completely at the mercy of their lords, with roughly the political awareness of a turnip, you will misunderstand almost everything about what happened. And more importantly, you will miss the part that makes it genuinely remarkable. The word peasant is one of those historical terms that has been so thoroughly flattened by centuries of casual use that it has lost almost all of its actual meaning. Today it functions mostly as an insult, a shorthand for someone unsophisticated, ignorant and low. In 14th century England, however, it describes something considerably more complex than that, and unpacking that complexity is the first step toward understanding why the summer of 1381 happened at all, and why it happened the way it did. Start with the sheer scale. Somewhere between 80 and 85% of the entire population of medieval Europe fell under the broad, unwieldy umbrella of peasant. Think about that for a moment. Roughly 8 out of every 10 people alive in England in the mid-1300s were, by the technical classification of the time, peasants. That is not a fringe group. That is not a minority. That is essentially everyone, which should immediately suggest that this was not a homogeneous mass of interchangeable poor people, all living identical, miserable lives. An umbrella that covers 85% of the population is going to have a lot of very different things sheltering under it. At one end of what we might loosely call the peasant spectrum, you had the villains sometimes called serfs, though historians tend to argue about the precise distinction with the enthusiasm of people who really enjoy arguing about precise distinctions. These were men and women who were legally bound to the land of a specific lord, not enslaved in the Roman sense, but not free in any meaningful modern sense either. A villain could not leave their lord's estate without permission. They could not sell land without permission. They could not even, in some arrangements, allow their daughters to marry without first paying a fee to the lord, a delightful little transaction that went by the name merchant, and which served as a reminder that in the eyes of the law, a villain's family was essentially an asset of the estate. The lord did not own these people outright, but he owned a remarkably comprehensive set of rights over almost every significant decision they might make. If you're wondering what the peasants were angry about, Mercia is a reasonable place to start. Below the villains in practical terms, though not always in legal classification, were the cottagers and smallholders, people who held tiny plots of land, sometimes just a cottage and a garden, and survived by combining whatever they could grow with wage labour for larger landholders or for the lord himself. Their margin for error was essentially zero. A bad harvest did not mean a difficult year. A bad harvest meant genuine life-threatening hunger. They owned so little that there was not much left to take from them, which was mildly inconvenient for the tax collectors and enormously inconvenient for the cottagers themselves. But here is where the picture starts to get interesting, and where the neat pyramid of medieval society begins to look a lot less like a pyramid and a lot more like one of those abstract sculptures where you are not entirely sure which end is up. Because at the other end of the peasant spectrum you had people who were technically classified as peasants, but whose actual economic position would have surprised most modern observers considerably. The wealthier freeholders, peasants who held their land by free tenure rather than villein service, could accumulate significant amounts of property. Some of them employed other people to work their land. Some of them were involved in local trade, ran small businesses, operated mills or forges. A successful yeoman farmer in 14th century England might own more actual wealth in land, livestock and stored goods than some members of the lesser nobility. He just did not have the social status to go with it, which in medieval England was a distinction that mattered enormously, even if it occasionally struck the successful yeoman as somewhat unfair. This is the detail that tends to get quietly dropped from the simplified version of the story, and it matters more than it might initially appear, because the revolt of 1381 was not organised and executed by people with nothing. It was organised and executed by people who had something, some of them quite a lot of something, and who had developed enough economic independence, enough practical experience managing their own affairs, and enough frustrated awareness of the legal and social ceiling above them to articulate a sophisticated political programme. The leaders of the revolt were not starving men lashing out blindly. They were people who understood the system they lived under, had thought carefully about its injustices, and had decided to do something about it. This distinction is not a minor footnote, it is the whole story. To understand why this particular group of people reached this particular breaking point in this particular year, you have to understand something about the geography of medieval English society, not the physical geography, but the social kind. The feudal system, as it is usually described in textbooks, presents itself as a clean, logical arrangement. At the top, the king. Below him, the great lords and barons, who hold their land directly from the crown. Below them, the lesser lords and knights, who hold their land from the barons. Below them, the peasants, who work the land and owe various forms of service and payment to whoever sits above them in the chain. Everyone knows their place. Everyone fulfills their role. The system works because God ordained it this way, and questioning the arrangement is therefore not just socially impolite but theologically problematic. The Church was, needless to say, enthusiastically on board with this interpretation. The idea that social hierarchy was divinely sanctioned was enormously useful if you happened to occupy the upper portions of it, and the medieval Church occupied the upper portions with considerable comfort. Bishops and abbots controlled vast estates. The Church as an institution owned somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the land in England. It collected its own taxes, operated its own courts, and enjoyed legal exemptions that would have seemed remarkable even by the generous standards of medieval aristocratic privilege. When wandering preachers began pointing out that Jesus of Nazareth had not actually said anything particularly favourable about feudal land tenure, the institutional Church tended to respond with a combination of excommunication and imprisonment, which was the medieval equivalent of strongly disagreeing. But the clean pyramid of the textbook had never been entirely accurate, and by the mid-1300s it was under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The economic reality of medieval England was considerably messier than the ideological model suggested. The expansion of trade and craft production in the 12th and 13th centuries had created a new class of people, urban merchants, skilled artisans, prosperous tradespeople who did not fit neatly into the feudal categories at all. They were not lords, but they were not peasants in the traditional sense either. They held property, employed workers, travelled for business, and participated in regional and international trade networks. The feudal model had no particularly elegant slot for them, so the model largely ignored them, which they did not find especially flattering. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the practical application of feudal obligations had always been considerably more negotiated and contested than the theoretical framework implied. Lords needed their peasants to actually work, which gave the peasants at least some leverage in practice, even if the law suggested otherwise. Customary rights, the specific terms under which particular villagers owed particular obligations, varied enormously from estate to estate and had been negotiated, argued over, and adjusted through generations of local history. What a villain owed on one lord's estate might be entirely different from what a villain owed on the neighbouring estate, and both sets of obligations had accumulated the legitimising patina of tradition. Peasants knew their customary rights in forensic detail. When lords tried to change those terms, as they periodically did, with varying degrees of subtlety, the peasants noticed, objected, and sometimes organised resistance. This was not revolutionary consciousness in the modern sense. It was more like extremely determined workplace grievance management. But it meant that the peasantry was not the passive, unorganised mass that the ruling class would have preferred them to be. The relationship between peasants and the law is particularly worth pausing on, because it cuts against the most common modern assumption about medieval social power. The law in 14th century England was very much a tool of the ruling class. This is not in serious dispute. But it was a tool that peasants had learned to use with considerable skill within its own framework. Manorial courts, which handled most of the practical legal business affecting peasant lives, were theoretically instruments of lords' authority. In practice, they also provided a forum where peasants could raise complaints, dispute obligations, and occasionally win. Peasants brought cases, they gave evidence, they challenged interpretations of custom, they appealed to higher courts when the lower ones did not give them what they wanted. None of this was easy, and the system was stacked against them in structural ways that no amount of individual legal cleverness could entirely overcome. But the point is that people who were supposedly the passive bottom layer of a rigid hierarchy had actually developed a remarkably sophisticated practical understanding of how power worked and how to push back against it within institutional channels. When those channels stopped working, when the institutional response to legitimate grievance became something along the lines of "your complaints are noted, and we are raising your taxes," the shift to extra-institutional action was not as large a leap as it might appear. Now, all of this social complexity existed inside a physical world that was, by any honest assessment, genuinely difficult. Medieval agriculture was not the idyllic pastoral scene that artists from later centuries sometimes like to paint. It was hard, physical, weather-dependent labour conducted with tools and techniques that had not changed substantially in centuries. The heavy-wheeled plough that allowed cultivation of northern European clay soils was a genuine technological achievement, but ploughing with a team of oxen required significant animal resources that not every peasant household possessed. The three-field system rotating crops between winter grain, spring grain, and fallow was a sensible response to the challenges of soil fertility, but it also meant that roughly a third of available farmland was producing nothing in any given year. Yields, by modern agricultural standards, were modest to the point of being faintly depressing. A good wheat harvest might return 4 or 5 grains for every one planted. A bad year might return barely enough to replant for the next season. Peasant housing ranged from adequate to genuinely difficult, depending on local resources and individual prosperity. The wealthier peasant families of the 14th century lived in longhouses structures that combined living quarters and barn under one roof, which was practical for winter warmth and moderately challenging for anyone with strong views about the separation of domestic space from livestock. The interior of a longhouse was typically divided by a low partition, with the human half containing a central hearth. No chimney, the smoke drifted upward and out through gaps in the thatch, which was very efficient at filling the interior with a gentle permanent haze, a sleeping area, basic furniture, and the accumulated domestic equipment of daily life. At the animal end, cattle and pigs provided heat through the winter in a mutually beneficial arrangement that probably neither species particularly enjoyed but both tolerated. For the poorer peasant households, even this basic structure might be a stretch, and cottages that amounted to a single room shared between a family and whatever animals they owned were not unusual. Food was seasonal, monotonous by modern standards, and calorie-dense out of pure necessity. Bred primarily rye or barley for the majority of peasants, since wheat was more valuable as a market commodity was the foundation of the diet. Pottage, a thick soup made from whatever vegetables and grains were available, appeared at most meals in one form or another. Legumes, peas, beans, lentils provided protein, and were the backbone of the peasant diet, to a degree that modern nutritional science would actually endorse, though medieval peasants were operating on practical experience rather than macronutrient analysis. Meat was eaten, but less frequently than the noble diet that dominates the historical record. Dairy products, cheese, butter, milk were important, especially for households with cattle. Fish was significant in areas near rivers or the coast, and preserved fish, salted or dried, was traded widely. The diet was not always adequate, and in lean years it could fall dangerously short, but for most people in most years it was functional if unexciting. The medieval peasant was not, on the whole, perpetually starving. They were, however, perpetually aware of how thin the margin was between adequate and not. Beyond the purely material, daily life for a peasant in 14th century England was structured by a rhythm of agricultural seasons, religious observances, and community obligations that gave it a coherence and meaning that the bare economic facts sometimes obscure. The parish church was the centre of social life in a way that is hard to translate into modern terms, not just as a place of worship, but as a meeting point, a source of information, a space for communal celebration, and a stage for the dramas of birth, marriage, and death that marked the passage of individual lives. The festivals of the agricultural year, Plough Monday, Midsummer, harvest celebrations combined religious observance with genuine community festivity, providing the psychological relief valves that any culture operating under significant stress needs. When later observers tried to describe the uprising of 1381 as the action of people who had nothing to lose, they were missing something important. People with truly nothing to lose do not organise. They do not maintain discipline over weeks of marching. They do not articulate political demands. The rebels of 1381 were fighting to protect and expand what they had, not in the desperate nothing-matters thrashing of people with no stake in the world. The social geography of the village itself deserves more attention than it usually gets. The image of medieval peasants as isolated individuals, each struggling alone against the indifferent forces of nature and overlordship, is simply inaccurate. The village community was a functional social unit with a complex internal structure. Collective decisions about agricultural management, which fields to plant, when to begin harvest, how to manage common resources like the village pasture or the woodland required genuine communal deliberation. The village assembly in various forms was a real institution with real decision-making power within its sphere. Networks of mutual aid, labour exchange, and social obligation connected households in ways that made the community something more than a collection of isolated families. When a family faced a crisis illness, crop failure, the death of a working adult, the community network was often the first line of response. This was not sentimentality. It was practical mutual insurance in a world where formal insurance did not exist. All of which means that when the moment of crisis came in 1381, the community structures were already there. The networks of communication, trust, and coordinated action that made a regional uprising possible did not emerge from nowhere. They had been built over generations of collective agricultural management, communal decision-making, and shared struggle with the demands of lord and weather alike. The revolt did not create solidarity. It channeled existing solidarity toward an entirely new purpose. But here is the question that keeps nagging at any honest examination of this period. If the peasantry had always lived under the conditions described above, if the feudal system had always extracted labour and service and payment from those at the bottom, if the structural inequality had always been present, then what made 1381 different? What turned a society that had been managing imperfectly, resentfully, but managing into one that rose in open rebellion across multiple counties simultaneously? The answer to that question requires understanding not just the normal conditions of medieval peasant life, but what happened to those normal conditions when the 14th century decided to absolutely fall apart. And fall apart it did, in ways that make the early 21st century look comparatively restrained as a period of historical disruption. The sequence of catastrophes that struck 14th century Europe is almost numbing in its thoroughness. They arrived in waves, each one hammering a population that had not yet recovered from the last, and they did not just kill people. Though they killed a remarkable number of people, they also systematically dismantled the social and economic assumptions that the medieval order had been built on. Understanding those catastrophes is essential to understanding why the peasants of 1381 were not simply poor and suffering. They had always been both, but were poor, suffering, and crucially furious. The English countryside in the early 1300s was, by the standards of medieval agriculture, genuinely overcrowded. The population had grown steadily through the 12th and 13th centuries, driven by agricultural expansion, the clearing of new land, and improvements in farming technique. By 1300, England had somewhere in the region of 5 to 6 million people, which was close to or possibly beyond the sustainable carrying capacity of medieval agricultural technology in bad years. The margin between adequate food production and not enough had narrowed considerably. When the weather turned bad, there was very little slack in the system. The weather turned bad. Starting in the second decade of the 14th century, Europe entered a period of climate instability, cooler, wetter summers, failed harvests, and the first genuinely widespread famines in generations. The Great Famine, as it is usually called, struck between roughly 1315 and 1322, and it was devastating in ways that modern populations living in a world of global food supply chains find difficult to fully internalize. 3 to 4 years of successive poor harvests wiped out reserves. Grain prices spiked to levels that put bread beyond the reach of the poor. Livestock died in enormous numbers from disease and starvation, destroying the animal capital that agricultural households had spent years building up. In the worst affected regions, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population died. This was not a localized event. It stretched across most of Northern Europe. The generation that survived it emerged into a world that had been materially depleted and psychologically marked by the experience of mass death from hunger in a way that previous generations had not known. Recovery was slow and incomplete. The agricultural economy rebuilt over the following decades, but the trauma of the famine left its mark in the collective memory of rural communities, a newly sharpened awareness of just how fragile the margin was, just how quickly things could go wrong, and just how little assistance the lords and the church were likely to provide when the crisis came. And then, before the full recovery from the famine was complete, the second catastrophe arrived. The Black Death reached England in the summer of 1348, having already cut a devastating path across southern Europe and France. It spread with a speed that contemporary observers found genuinely incomprehensible. Within 18 months it had reached every corner of the kingdom. Estimates of mortality vary, and the honest answer is that we cannot know with precision, but the scholarly consensus is that somewhere between 30 and 45% of the English population died in the initial outbreak. Some regions were worse. Some individual communities lost more than half their people. The towns, where population density made transmission more efficient, were hit particularly hard. So were the monasteries, whose communal life made them almost perfectly designed for rapid disease spread. The second wave, in 1361, killed another significant portion of those who had survived the first. The third wave, in 1368 to 1369, took more still. By the time the immediate cycle of plague outbreaks had run its course, England had lost roughly half its pre-plague population. This was demographic destruction on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. It was not a temporary crisis followed by recovery. It was a permanent structural transformation of the society. And here is where the story takes a turn that is rarely emphasized in the standard account, and which is absolutely essential to understanding what happened in 1381. Because the Black Death did not just kill people, it fundamentally altered the economic relationship between the surviving peasants and the lords who depended on their labour. When roughly half the working population of England is suddenly no longer available to work, the basic supply and demand arithmetic of labour markets shifts dramatically. Land was suddenly abundant relative to the people available to work it. Lords who needed their fields ploughed and their harvests brought in suddenly found themselves competing for workers rather than the other way around. And the surviving workers, for the first time in living memory, found themselves in a position to negotiate. Wages rose. In some cases, they rose very substantially. Peasants who had previously been bound by the terms of villein tenure began drifting away from their lords' estates, moving to areas where better terms were on offer, or simply taking advantage of the chaos to claim a freedom they had previously been denied. Former serfs began presenting themselves as free labourers. Lords desperate for workers to bring in harvests were not always in a position to argue. The social mobility that the feudal system had been specifically designed to prevent was beginning to happen, not through political revolution, but through the quiet economic logic of labour scarcity. This was, from the perspective of the English ruling class, an absolute disaster. Not the plague itself, necessarily, though the plague was clearly inconvenient, but the economic and social consequences of labour scarcity were a direct threat to the entire system on which their wealth and power depended. If peasants could simply leave and work for better wages elsewhere, the whole structure of villein tenure became unenforceable. If a free labour market was going to develop through the back door of post-plague demographics, the lords were going to find themselves negotiating with the people they had previously commanded. This was not a scenario that appealed to them. The response, delivered with what we might charitably describe as optimistic speed, was the Statute of Labourers of 1351. This was legislation that attempted, in essence, to freeze economic reality in place by royal decree. Wages were mandated to remain at their pre-plague levels. Workers were forbidden to demand more than the traditional rate, regardless of what the market might suggest the work was actually worth. Peasants were prohibited from leaving their lords' estates without permission. Lords were prohibited from offering above-standard wages to attract workers from other estates. The whole apparatus of feudal labour relations was to be maintained exactly as it had been before the plague, despite the fact that the plague had killed roughly half the people whose behaviour the system assumed. The enforcement of this legislation was, as you might imagine, somewhat challenging. The economic pressure created by labour scarcity was simply more powerful, in many localities, than the ability of local authorities to police wage agreements. Workers continued to demand higher pay. Lords continued to quietly offer it when they needed to. The labour market continued to shift in favour of workers, however slowly. But the attempt to enforce the statute created its own particular kind of social friction, the friction of people who can see that they have genuine economic leverage, who understand that the market says they should be earning more, but who are being told by the law that they are not allowed to act on that knowledge. It was the friction of a felt injustice, which is a specific and particularly combustible kind of grievance. Because here is what the Statute of Labourers communicated to every labouring person in England. Stripped of its legal language, the people in charge were aware that the plague had changed the economic rules, and they had decided that the new rules should not apply to you. The surviving half of the population, the people who had watched their neighbours and family members die in extraordinary numbers, who had survived years of social disruption and economic chaos, who had in many cases worked harder than ever to keep communities and agricultural systems functioning. These people were being told that their increased economic value was irrelevant because the law said so. This is the context without which 1381 cannot be understood. The revolt was not simply the spontaneous expression of ancient misery. It was the product of a specific and identifiable sequence, the experience of genuine economic opportunity in the aftermath of catastrophe, followed by a systematic legal attempt to close that opportunity down, followed by 30 years of increasing frustration as the gap between what people knew they deserved and what the system allowed them to claim continued to grow. The rebels of 1381 were not people who had suddenly discovered they were oppressed. They were people who had been acutely aware of their oppression for a generation, who had watched the economic arguments for changing the system become increasingly compelling, and who had concluded that the system was not going to change through patient legal channels. There is a phrase that appears in various forms in the historical record of this period, usually attributed to the tradition of preaching that circulated outside official church channels. The question, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was, in its medieval theological context, a genuine and pointed argument. If all human beings shared common descent from Adam and Eve, if the original human pair had sustained themselves through labour with no lord over them, then where exactly had the nobility come from? This was not a frivolous question. It was a challenge to the theological legitimacy of the entire social order, and the institutional church found it sufficiently dangerous to spend considerable effort suppressing the preachers who raised it. The fact that it kept circulating despite those efforts tells you something about how widely it resonated. Understanding who the peasants really were then is not just an academic exercise in social history. It is the foundation of understanding why what happened in 1381 was possible. These were not ignorant people who happened to reach the end of their rope. These were people with community structures, legal knowledge, economic experience, political grievances, and increasingly a theoretical framework for arguing that the world ought to be organised differently. When the third poll tax in 4 years pushed that accumulated frustration over the edge, The explosion that followed was not random. It had a direction, a purpose, and a set of demands that reflected a genuine political consciousness forged over decades of lived experience with the machinery of medieval inequality. Which is exactly why it frightened the people at the top as much as it did. It is much easier to dismiss a riot than it is to dismiss a movement that knows what it wants and has a clear-eyed understanding of who is standing in its way. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it does something important to the way we tend to think about historical change. The standard model of social history tends to organise itself around the powerful, the kings who made decisions, the lords who enforced them, the armies that carried them out. The people at the bottom of the social structure appear in this model mostly as either victims or occasionally as chaotic disruptors who briefly interrupt the flow of events before order is restored. What the evidence of 1381 suggests is something considerably more interesting, that the people at the bottom had a political life of their own, a developing capacity for organised collective action, and a set of ideas about justice and dignity that were not simply borrowed from their betters, but emerged from the specific texture of their own experience. This is a story about people who were told, repeatedly and in multiple ways, that they did not count, and who decided, for one extraordinary summer, to prove that assessment wrong. The way they proved it, the strategies they used, the demands they made, and the reasons those demands were ultimately frustrated, is a story that has quite a lot to say about how power actually works, and about the gap between the way societies describe themselves and the way they actually function. The 14th century is a long time ago. The specific details of villein tenure and poll tax assessments and manorial court procedures belong to a world that no longer exists. But the underlying dynamics of economic opportunity suppressed by law, of legitimate grievance dismissed by authority, of people finding ways to exercise collective power when individual power is denied them, those dynamics are considerably less dated than the historical packaging might suggest. So when we talk about 1381, we are not talking about ancient curiosities. We are talking about a moment when the fundamental question of how societies distribute power and wealth and dignity was raised by the people with the least of all three, and raised with enough force to leave a permanent mark on the history of a nation. The specifics are medieval. The argument is not. What came next? The 3 poll taxes in 4 years. The tax collectors showing up at doors, the moment in a small Essex town when a man named Thomas Baker looked at a royal commissioner and said, no, that story belongs to the next chapter of events. But it grows directly from the ground we have just covered, a ground of accumulated grievance, of frustrated economic hope, of people who understood the system they were fighting against, and of a community infrastructure capable of turning individual anger into coordinated collective action. The match and the powder were both already there. What we need to understand next is what actually struck the spark. There is one more thing worth establishing before we move forward, because it tends to get lost in the drama of what follows. The England of 1381 was not a society where communication was easy, or information travelled quickly. There were no newspapers. There was no postal service in any modern sense. Most people could not read. The idea that a coordinated uprising could emerge across multiple counties simultaneously, with shared demands and recognisable leadership, requires some explanation, and that explanation takes us back, again, to the underestimated organisational capacity of the medieval peasant community. The mechanisms were informal, but surprisingly effective. Markets weekly, fortnightly, annual fairs were points of convergence where people from multiple villages gathered and where news travelled. The network of parish churches, whatever else could be said about the institution that ran them, provided a physical infrastructure of regular communal gathering that covered the entire country. Travelling peddlers, itinerant craftsmen, seasonal agricultural workers who moved between estates, all of these formed channels through which information, stories, complaints, and organising impulses could flow. The wandering preachers who operated outside the formal church structure were particularly important in this regard, functioning not just as religious voices, but as something closer to what we might now call community organisers, moving from village to village with a message that connected the specific local grievances of each community to a broader narrative about justice and divine order. When complaints were shared across these networks, they tended to cluster around recognisable themes. The poll tax was universally hated, but it was not the only target. The legal restrictions on peasant movement, the prohibition on leaving the lord's estate without permission, were felt as a constant daily indignity by everyone subject to them. The labour laws that kept wages artificially depressed were an ongoing economic injury experienced by anyone who worked for wages. The corruption of local administrators, the rack-renting of landlords who took advantage of post-plague demographic shifts to increase their demands, the arbitrary exercise of manorial court authority, all of these were regular topics in the conversation that circulated through market days and tavern evenings, and the informal social gatherings that every community generates. What is remarkable, in retrospect, is not that this discontent eventually produced action. It is that it took as long as it did. The 30-odd years between the Black Death and the Revolt were not years of passive resignation. They were years of ongoing low-level resistance work slowdowns, rent strikes, legal challenges, flight from estates, petitions to higher authorities that constituted a kind of continuous pressure on the system. None of these individual actions was sufficient to change anything fundamental. Collectively, over decades, they contributed to a climate in which open confrontation began to seem like a viable option, rather than a suicidal one. By 1381, the psychological threshold had shifted. Enough people had seen enough small acts of resistance succeed, or at least survive, that the calculation of risk versus potential gain had changed in ways that made a larger action conceivable. There is also the question of what people thought they were doing when they rose in 1381, and the answer is considerably more nuanced than they were trying to destroy the feudal system. Most of the rebels, to the extent that we can reconstruct their intentions from surviving documents, were not trying to overturn the social order in any comprehensive sense. They were trying to fix specific things that were broken. They wanted the poll tax repealed. They wanted the statute of labourers abolished. They wanted the right to move freely and to negotiate their labour terms on the open market. They wanted corrupt officials, specific individuals they named and targeted, removed and punished. They wanted legal recognition of their customary rights, not the abolition of the manorial system, but the enforcement of its traditional terms as they understood them. The demands were radical in the context of the time, because they would have fundamentally altered the economic basis of aristocratic and clerical wealth. But they were framed as conservative restoration rather than revolutionary innovation, a return to proper order, not the imposition of a new one. This framing was strategic as much as sincere, but it mattered, because it meant the rebels could present themselves as seeking justice within the existing moral framework rather than attacking the framework itself. This is why the theological dimension of the uprising, the ideas associated with wandering preachers about divine equality, and the illegitimacy of social hierarchy sat alongside rather than in contradiction to the more pragmatic economic demands. The argument from Adam and Eve was not a demand for communism. It was a moral legitimation of the specific changes being sought. If all people were equal in the sight of God, then the law should not be allowed to make them permanently and irreversibly unequal in the sight of the Lord. It was a targeted argument, aimed at specific legal disabilities, grounded in a theological framework that everyone in the society shared at least formally. The rebels were not speaking a foreign language. They were using the vocabulary of the culture against the purposes to which that culture's authorities had applied it, which, as a political strategy, was actually quite clever. The men and women who walked out of their villages in the summer of 1381 and began the march toward London were not a mob, and they were not naive. They were a people with a long memory of grievance, a sophisticated understanding of the system that had shaped their lives, a set of practical community skills developed over generations of collective agricultural management, and a clear enough sense of what they wanted to change that they could articulate it in specific negotiable demands. They were, in short, exactly the kind of people that history tends to overlook when it's busy paying attention to the kings and lords and bishops who left more paperwork. The fact that they came so close to succeeding, and that even in failing they permanently altered the course of English social history, is one of the things that makes their story worth telling carefully, and worth telling true. We have already established that the people who rose in 1381 were not passive, not ignorant, and not operating from pure desperation. But to understand the specific shape of their anger, why it took the form it did, why it targeted the people it targeted, and why it erupted when it did. Rather than a decade earlier or later, we need to spend some time with the 14th century itself. Because the 14th century, viewed from a comfortable distance, looks less like a historical period and more like a stress test of how much a society can absorb before something fundamental breaks. England did not fail that test in the ordinary sense. The society survived. But it survived changed, and the changes it underwent in the 100 years before 1381 set the precise conditions that made the revolt not just possible, but in retrospect, almost inevitable. If you had been a reasonably prosperous English farmer in, say, 1290, the future might have looked cautiously optimistic. The 13th century had been, by medieval standards, a period of relative stability and growth. Population had expanded. New land had been brought under cultivation. Trade had increased. The English wool trade in particular had developed into a significant commercial enterprise, connecting English wool producers to Flemish weavers and Italian merchants in a network of international commerce that brought real money into the rural economy. The great cathedrals were being built. The towns were growing. The institutional frameworks of English law and governance were being elaborated and refined. There were problems. Naturally, there are always problems, but the overall trajectory had a vaguely upward quality that made cautious optimism seem reasonable. By 1400, that farmer's grandchildren would be living in a landscape that had lost somewhere between a third and half of its people to plague, had endured multiple devastating famines, had been taxed continuously to fund a foreign war of no discernible benefit to them personally, and had watched the legal framework that was supposed to govern their lives be rewritten repeatedly by people who seemed primarily interested in ensuring that none of the post-catastrophe economic improvements actually reached anyone below the gentry. The journey between those two endpoints between 1290 and 1400 is a story of how several different kinds of crisis combined and compounded each other in ways that no single crisis could have achieved on its own. And at the centre of that story sits a question that the historian Barbara Tuchman famously put at the heart of her work on this period. Not whether the 14th century was bad, but why it managed to be quite so comprehensively bad in quite so many different directions at the same time. The 100 Years' War is the dimension of 14th century catastrophe that tends to get the least attention in discussions of the Peasants' Revolt, and that is a significant omission. When we covered the Great Famine and the Black Death in the previous section, those were disasters that arrived from outside the human world, so to speak from weather patterns and pathogens that did not care about politics. The 100 Years' War was different. It was a disaster that the English ruling class chose, repeatedly and enthusiastically, and the costs of that choice were borne almost entirely by the people who had no say in the decision. Understanding that dynamic is essential to understanding why the rebels of 1381 directed so much of their anger specifically at government officials, tax collectors, and the apparatus of royal administration. The conflict between England and France that historians group under the convenient but somewhat misleading label of the 100 Years' War began formally in 1337, when Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother's line and decided to press that claim militarily. The legal basis of the claim was, to put it diplomatically, a matter of interpretation. The French had a different interpretation. The question was resolved through the traditional medieval dispute resolution mechanism of extremely expensive armed conflict conducted primarily in other people's agricultural land, which was expensive and destructive for everyone involved, but particularly for the French peasants whose villages happened to be in the way of whichever army was currently marching through. For England, the war had two distinct phases in the 14th century that affected the domestic population in rather different ways. The early decades brought spectacular military victories, Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356 that did wonders for the morale of the English military aristocracy, and approximately nothing for the welfare of the English peasantry. The victories were real, and they generated considerable enthusiasm among the classes of people whose enthusiasm was recorded in contemporary chronicles. The costs were also real, and they were distributed in a characteristically medieval fashion. Those who fought got glory, those who paid got taxes, and the taxes were substantial. Medieval warfare was expensive in ways that are easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. An army in the field required not just soldiers but an enormous logistical tail food, fodder for horses, weapons and armour, shipping for the Channel crossing, payments to contractors and suppliers, wages for professional soldiers, and the administrative staff needed to manage all of the above. The English crown had various mechanisms for financing military operations, including borrowing from Italian banking houses, a relationship that the Italian bankers came to regard with increasing ambivalence as the royal debts mounted, forced loans from English merchants, and direct taxation of the population through parliamentary grants. The parliamentary grants were the mechanism that most directly touched the peasantry, and they were frequent, substantial, and bitterly resented. The politics of war finance in 14th century England had a particular quality of disconnection between decision and consequence that tends to generate resentment. The decisions about whether to pursue the French war and on what terms were made by the king and his advisers with some consultation of the great lords. The parliament that granted the taxation was dominated by the same great lords and the wealthier gentry. The people who actually paid the taxes through direct levies and through the inflation and economic disruption that military spending generated had no representation in these discussions worth mentioning. They were consulted in the way that a building is consulted about whether its owner wishes to renovate. The decision had already been made, and the only remaining question was how much of the cost would fall on which structural elements. Edward III's early victories had at least the merit of being victories, which made the taxation somewhat more tolerable from a psychological standpoint, if not a financial one. The second half of the 14th century was considerably more difficult. The Black Death had gutted the available manpower for military campaigns. The energetic young King of Crécy grew old, and the quality of English military leadership deteriorated accordingly. The great victories were followed by years of expensive, inconclusive campaigning that produced neither decisive outcomes nor the profitable ransoms of high-born prisoners that had previously been among the more lucrative perquisites of medieval warfare. The Peace of Bretigny in 1360 briefly seemed to offer resolution, but its terms unravelled within a decade, and the war ground on into renewed futility. By the 1370s, the military situation was actively bad. The French, under the methodical leadership of Charles V and his remarkable General du Guesclin, had developed a strategy of systematic attrition that avoided pitched battles where English longbowmen had proven devastatingly effective in favour of guerrilla tactics, harassment, and the patient recovery of territory through political and logistical pressure rather than direct assault. It was extremely effective and, from the English perspective, enormously frustrating. The English paid for armies. The armies marched. Nothing was definitively won. The armies came home. The next tax demand arrived. The political figure who sits at the centre of the English government's increasingly unpopular management of the war in the 1370s is John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the third surviving son of Edward III and, by the time of the revolt, the wealthiest and most powerful magnate in England. John of Gaunt was not a bad man by the standards of his class and time, which admittedly is not an especially high bar. He was educated, politically sophisticated, and capable of genuine diplomatic subtlety. He was also the embodiment of everything the rebels of 1381 found most objectionable about the English ruling class. Enormously wealthy, personally comfortable behind the walls of his magnificent palace, pursuing foreign ambitions of his own in Spain alongside the French war, and completely insulated from the economic consequences of the policies his influence helped shape. When the rebels marched on London, the Savoy Palace, John of Gaunt's London residence, one of the grandest buildings in England, was among their primary targets. Not because John of Gaunt was uniquely villainous, but because he was uniquely visible as a symbol of the gap between those who made decisions and those who paid for them. The conduct of the war also introduced a new and particularly resented figure into the English countryside, the military impressment agent. The Crown had the legal power to compel men to serve in military campaigns, and the exercise of this power fell most heavily on the rural population. Men could be taken from their villages, marched to the coast, shipped to France, and if they were lucky returned some months later with wages that had often been paid irregularly or not at all. If they were less lucky, they did not return at all. The disruption to agricultural labour this created was significant, and it landed on top of all the other labour disruptions caused by the plague and by the operation of the Statute of Labourers. The idea that the men running this system, the impressment agents, the tax collectors, the sheriffs responsible for enforcing the labour laws, represented legitimate authority rather than organised predation, was one that the rural population was finding increasingly difficult to maintain. There is a particular aspect of the 100 Years' War's domestic impact that rarely makes it into the summary accounts, but which shaped the political consciousness of the men who would lead the revolt, the experience of soldiers returning from France. England sent armies to France repeatedly across the 14th century, and a significant portion of the men in those armies were drawn from the peasant and artisan classes. Archers, in particular, were recruited from the general population rather than the knightly class. These men came back from France having seen how other societies were organised, having experienced the relative freedom of military service outside the hierarchical constraints of their home villages, and having developed practical skills in organisation, leadership, and the application of collective pressure. Some of them came back with a particular awareness of how the machinery of power actually worked, how orders were given and followed, how supply lines were organised, how large groups of men were coordinated toward common goals. This was practical knowledge. In 1381, it would prove useful. The 100 Years' War also generated something that is easy to overlook, a sense of national identity that cut across class lines in ways that the feudal system itself did not naturally produce. Soldiers from different regions of England fought together, and the experience of shared military service with all its hardships, its camaraderie, and its occasional triumphs created bonds of solidarity that transcended the boundaries of the local manor and village. The rebels of 1381 spoke consistently in the name of the commons of England, a concept that would have been considerably more abstract before decades of mixed-class military service had given it some experiential content. The war that the ruling class had fought for glory and territorial ambition had, as one of its unintended consequences, helped create the very sense of collective identity that would turn against those rulers in 1381. Now, the war did not happen in a vacuum. It happened against the backdrop of everything else the 14th century was doing to England simultaneously, and the interaction between those different pressures is where the real complexity lies. The Black Death and its consequences, already covered in the previous section, created the specific economic tension between available opportunity and legal suppression that would fuel the revolt. But the war added dimensions that pure economic analysis cannot capture. It added the experience of direct state extraction, the grinding reality of taxation for purposes that delivered no benefit to those paying it, and the particular anger of people who had given military service and received in return not gratitude but higher tax demands. The 100 Years' War also interacted with the labour crisis in specific ways. The military campaigns of the 1370s in particular came during a period when the post-plague labour shortage was at its most economically significant, when the leverage that surviving peasant workers had over their lords was greatest. The Crown's demand for military manpower took men away from the fields at precisely the moment when their labour was most valuable and most contested. The lords who were already fighting to maintain control over their labour force through the Statute of Labourers found military impressment adding to their difficulties. The workers who were just beginning to exercise new economic leverage found that leverage interrupted by involuntary military service. Neither group was happy about this, and the political consequences of that unhappiness were, as we shall see, rather significant. Let us turn now to the economic aftermath of the plague with a degree of focus it deserves, because this is where the specific mechanism of radicalization can be traced most clearly. The basic argument that the death of half the workforce created labour scarcity, that gave workers new bargaining power, which the Statute of Labourers tried to suppress, is correct as far as it goes. But it understates the complexity and the human experience of what was actually happening in English villages and towns across the decades between 1348 and 1381. The immediate aftermath of the first plague outbreak was, economically speaking, chaotic in ways that the cold logic of supply and demand cannot entirely capture. The agricultural economy had lost, very suddenly, a substantial portion of its operating labour. Fields that had been under cultivation were abandoned because there was no one left to work them. Livestock wandered untended in some areas because the people responsible for tending them had died. Harvest rotted in fields. The basic machinery of rural economic life seized up in places, not because the machinery was broken, but because the people who ran it were gone. The first priority in the immediate aftermath was simply to maintain enough agricultural activity to keep the surviving population fed, which required desperate improvisation and the reallocation of labour that the normal rules of feudal tenure were not designed to accommodate. In this chaotic environment, the normal enforcement mechanisms of the feudal system also broke down, at least temporarily. Lords who had lost a substantial portion of their villein population needed to attract replacements, and the competition for surviving workers was real and intense. Former serfs who had previously had no practical ability to negotiate their terms of service found themselves being courted. The labour market developed in the cracks of the system, not through any official permission but through the straightforward economic logic of supply and demand operating faster than the legal apparatus could respond. Workers moved, they negotiated, they extracted better terms. The peasant who in 1347 had been bound to his lord's estate at fixed rates found in 1350 that he might be able to work different land for double the wages, and that some lords were willing to look the other way regarding his villein status if he would just please come and help bring in the harvest. This experience of genuine, tangible economic improvement, of leverage actually working, of the system bending to accommodate new realities, was psychologically transformative in ways that go beyond the purely financial. It demonstrated that the rules were not immutable. It demonstrated that the lords needed the workers at least as much as the workers needed the lords, possibly more. It demonstrated that the gap between legal status and practical reality could be navigated if one was willing to push. For a generation that had grown up inside a system that presented itself as fixed by God and tradition, this was genuinely revelatory. The world could be different. It was, in fact, already different, at least for those who had survived and moved and negotiated their way to better terms. The Statute of Labourers of 1351 landed in this environment like a very expensive wet blanket. The legislation was comprehensive in its ambitions. Wages were to be fixed at pre-plague rates. Workers were forbidden to leave their place of employment in search of better terms. Those who refused to work at the statutory wage could be imprisoned. Lords who paid above the statutory rate were also subject to penalties, though in practice, the enforcement focused considerably more on workers than on employers, for reasons that will not surprise anyone familiar with how enforcement of labour legislation tends to work historically. The justices of the peace who were appointed to enforce the statute were local landowners, which meant the people responsible for prosecuting workers who demanded too much money were precisely the people who benefited from suppressing wages. This arrangement was not, obviously, entirely impartial. The enforcement record of the Statute of Labourers over the 3 decades following its passage is a fascinating document of institutional futility. The courts were busy. Thousands of cases were prosecuted. Workers were fined, imprisoned, and occasionally branded, and wages continued to rise anyway, because the economic pressure was simply stronger than the enforcement capacity of the medieval state. What the statute could not do was create workers out of thin air. What it could not do was make dead people available to plough fields. The supply of labour was what it was, and no amount of legislation could alter that fundamental reality. So the wages rose, fitfully, unevenly, against constant legal pressure, through 3 decades of ongoing economic and legal warfare between the employing class trying to hold the line and the working class trying to claim what the market said they were worth. The effect of this prolonged tug-of-war on the political psychology of the rural working population was significant and specific. They were not simply frustrated by poverty, they had always been poor. They were frustrated by a system that acknowledged their increased value, implicitly through the sheer volume of legal effort devoted to suppressing it, while denying them the right to benefit from it. This is a qualitatively different kind of grievance from simple deprivation. It is the grievance of people who can see clearly and concretely that they are being cheated. The employer who paid below market rates while the law forbade the worker from going elsewhere was not simply benefiting from an impersonal economic system. He was actively, with legal sanction, taking money that the market said belonged to the worker and keeping it for himself. When the rebels of 1381 targeted legal documents, burning court rolls and manor records with particular enthusiasm, they were targeting the physical embodiment of this system of institutionalized theft. The documents were not abstractions. They were the specific instruments through which specific amounts of money and labour were extracted from specific people who were not allowed to refuse. The geographical distribution of post-plague economic change was also uneven in ways that added additional layers of tension to the situation. The areas that would prove most combustible in 1381 Essex, Kent, the counties immediately around London, were precisely the areas where economic development had proceeded furthest. These were not the most backward and exploited regions of England. They were among the most economically sophisticated, with stronger connections to London markets, more developed cash economies, more workers engaged in craft production and trade alongside or instead of purely agricultural labour. In these areas, the gap between what the market was offering and what the law permitted was widest, and the population had both the economic sophistication to understand what was being taken from them and the organisational capacity to do something about it. The role of the wool and cloth trades in this economic picture deserves attention. The Flemish weavers who lived and worked in England, skilled craftsmen who had been brought over or had migrated to participate in the developing cloth industry, were among the groups specifically targeted during the London phase of the revolt, which has puzzled some historians. The Flemings were not lords, not tax collectors, not obviously representatives of the oppressive legal apparatus, but they occupied a particular position in the economic structure that made them, in the eyes of some rebels, competitors rather than fellow victims. They had skills that commanded premium wages. They had guild organisations that protected their position. They had connections to merchant networks that gave them economic advantages. In a labour market where English workers were fighting for every penny of wage improvement against the weight of the Statute of Labourers, the presence of a group that operated partly outside those constraints and captured premium earnings was resented with an intensity that is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but important to understand. The revolt's complexity included this dimension of internal economic competition, alongside its more straightforward expressions of class antagonism. History is rarely tidy, and 1381 was no exception. The legal dimension of the post-plague economic conflict also worked through the manorial courts in ways that deserve specific attention. The court rolls of English manors in the decades following the Black Death record a remarkable increase in the number of cases involving labour disputes, fled serfs, and arguments over customary obligations. Lords attempted to use the courts to reclaim serfs who had escaped and established themselves elsewhere. They attempted to reinforce villain obligations that had lapsed during the chaos of the plague years. They attempted to recover wages paid above the statutory rate. Workers and their communities contested these claims, argued for their customary rights, and occasionally won. The courts were battlegrounds, and the battles that took place in them were not only about money, but about legal status, about whether a man was free or bound, about whether his children would inherit his obligations or his improvements. The status question was particularly explosive. The legal distinction between a free man and a villain was not just economic. It touched on something more fundamental, on dignity, on what it meant to be a full human being under the law. A villain, technically, had no property rights against his lord. Everything he held at his lord's pleasure. His legal identity was, in a formal sense, subsumed into his lord's. Free men had legal standing. They could own property in their own name. They could sue in the king's courts. They were, in the eyes of the law, persons in a way that villains were not quite, or not fully. The push after the plague for many peasant families was not just toward better wages, but toward free status, toward escaping the legal category that denied them full personhood. When lords used the courts to drag escaped villains back and reinforce their servile status, they were not just claiming labour and money. They were asserting the right to define these people as legally less than fully human. The fury this generated is not hard to understand. What is remarkable, looking back at the 3 decades between the Black Death and the Revolt, is how much the peasantry achieved through persistent, grinding, decentralised resistance, and how much remained blocked by the combination of legal suppression and political power. Wages did rise despite the statute. Labour mobility did increase, despite the prohibitions. Some families did escape villain status. The economic position of the rural working population did improve, unevenly and incompletely, across the post-plague generations. These were real gains, won through real struggle. But the pace of change was painfully slow relative to what the economic fundamentals would have suggested, and the legal framework continued to threaten reversal of every gain, at the discretion of a lord or a hostile justice of the peace. The combination of real partial progress and ongoing suppression created a political psychology that was neither resigned nor revolutionary, but something in between. Acutely aware of what more was possible, deeply frustrated by what continued to be denied, and increasingly convinced that the normal channels of redress were not going to deliver what was needed. There was also the matter of the church. The institutional church in 14th century England was a major landowner and a major employer of labour, and its behaviour in the aftermath of the plague was essentially indistinguishable from that of the secular lords, which is to say, it used the statute of labourers to suppress wages on its estates, fought to maintain the servile status of its tenants, and deployed its own courts to enforce obligations that would have been challenged anywhere. The moral authority that the Church claimed was thus rather visibly in tension with its economic behaviour. An institution that preached the dignity of the poor while legally suppressing their wages and imprisoning those who sought better terms was going to face some pointed questions eventually. The wandering preachers who asked those questions and pointed to the gap between the Church's teaching and its practice were responding to a real contradiction that a significant portion of the population had already noticed independently. Their preaching gave language and theological legitimacy to a critique that the economic experience of the post-plague decades had already made obvious to anyone paying attention, which was, essentially, everyone. By the late 1370s, then, England had accumulated a specific and potent combination of grievances, decades of war taxation for a conflict that seemed to deliver nothing but expense, 3 decades of labour law enforcement that had suppressed wages while failing to actually prevent their eventual rise, the worst outcome, in a sense, of both worlds. An ongoing legal assault on peasant freedom and customary rights through the manorial court system, a church that combined spiritual authority with economic exploitation in ways that generated a distinctive kind of cynicism, and underlying all of it, the demographic reality of a population that was still only slowly recovering from the losses of the plague, a reality that kept economic leverage on the workers' side of the ledger, while the legal system kept trying to move it back. Into this environment, the government introduced a poll tax, not once but 3 times in 4 years. The first, in 1377, charged a flat rate per person 4 pence for everyone over 14, regardless of income or wealth. The second, in 1379, attempted a sliding scale that proved difficult to administer. The third, in 1381, returned to a flat rate but tripled it 12 pence per person. A skilled labourer in 1381, earning perhaps 2 to 3 pence per day, would have owed 3 to 4 days' wages in a single tax payment. For a household with multiple adults, the combined liability could easily represent a week or more of a worker's entire annual income. This was not a trivial imposition, and it came without any plausible benefit to those paying it. The war that it nominally funded had by this point been generating expensive failure for years, and the men directing it were precisely the John of Gaunt class of wealthy magnates, whom the rural population had no particular reason to trust or support. The mechanisms of collection made everything worse, in the specific way that bad policy executed badly always does. The poll tax of 1381 was collected by commissioners sent into the counties, with authority to assess and collect the tax from every adult in their jurisdiction. The assessment process required commissioners to determine who was liable, which meant in practice determining who was over 14 and therefore subject to the tax. The methods employed by some collectors in making this determination were intrusive and humiliating in ways that contemporaries recorded with obvious outrage. Households were entered without invitation. Young women were physically examined to establish whether they had reached taxable age. The investigation of a family's domestic circumstances in order to assess their tax liability was experienced not as routine administration, but as a violation or reaching of official power into the household that went beyond what even the already extensive demands of the feudal system had routinely involved. It is worth pausing here to note something about the administrative competence of the English government in the late 14th century, because it bears directly on how the revolt was able to develop the way it did. The royal administration was not, by medieval standards, a particularly incompetent institution. England had one of the more sophisticated governmental systems in Europe, a functioning parliament, a developed common law tradition, an established network of local administration through the sheriffs and justices of the peace, and a reasonably functional tax collection apparatus. When it worked tolerably well. The problem in 1381 was that it did not work particularly well, and the reasons it did not work illuminate something important about the structural tensions of late medieval English governance. The justices of the peace who were supposed to enforce the statute of labourers were, as noted, local landowners with a direct financial interest in keeping wages down. Their enthusiasm for this role varied considerably. Some were energetic enforcers. Others were, shall we say, selective in their attention, particularly when the workers in question were employed by their neighbours or allies rather than their rivals. The result was enforcement that was inconsistent enough to frustrate both sides, rigorous enough to prevent the full expression of market wages, but leaky enough that workers with the right connections or sufficient mobility could often escape its full weight. Inconsistent enforcement of an unpopular law has a tendency to produce more resentment than either consistent enforcement or no enforcement at all, because it makes the arbitrariness of the system visible in ways that consistent application would obscure. The financial management of the French war was similarly revealing of structural dysfunction. The Crown borrowed money, spent it, borrowed more, ran up debts with Italian bankers that it was not always in a position to repay, and periodically had to go to Parliament for emergency taxation grants that required political negotiation with the great lords. The process was expensive, not just in money, but in political capital. Each tax grant required concessions. Each concession to the great lords was a concession made at the expense of those below them, since the lords were extremely skilled at ensuring that the costs of any deal fell as far down the social hierarchy as possible. The poll tax was, in a sense, the end product of this process, a form of taxation that bypassed the wealth of the great lords almost entirely. A flat per-person tax hits the poor far harder in proportional terms than the rich, which was not an accident, and extracted directly from the people with the least political representation and the most accumulated grievance. It was, as tax policy goes, a masterpiece of how to do the maximum possible damage with a single instrument. The administration of the 1381 poll tax also revealed the increasing exhaustion of the collection infrastructure. The earlier poll taxes had already pushed the limits of what the county-level apparatus could efficiently collect. The attempt to assess every adult in the kingdom required a level of administrative capacity and local cooperation that simply did not exist in the way the government assumed it did. In many areas, returns came in suspiciously low communities had clearly underreported their taxable adults, either through collective evasion or through the quiet cooperation of local officials who were themselves not particularly enthusiastic about the whole enterprise. The government's response to underreporting was to send in new commissioners to reassess which is how you get the aggressive household inspections that generated such intense personal outrage in Essex and Kent. The reassessment was not just a financial exercise, it was experienced as an accusation. You tried to cheat us, and now we're going to come into your house and check. The dignity cost of this was significant in a society where household honour was not a trivial consideration. There is also a generational dimension to the crisis of 1381 that tends to get overlooked. The rebels of 1381 were, for the most part, not the people who had lived through the Black Death as adults. They were the children and grandchildren of the Plague generation people who had grown up in the post-Plague world where labour had value and wages had been slowly, grudgingly rising, where the idea of free movement and free negotiation was not a distant memory, but a practical reality for many of their neighbours. They had not experienced the pre-Plague world, the world of absolute villain bondage, as a normal condition. For them, the aspirations that the Plague generation had barely dared express were starting to seem like reasonable expectations. The statute of labourers, to someone who had grown up in the 1360s and 1370s, watching wages slowly rise despite official suppression, did not look like a necessary bulwark of social order. It looked like a theft, perpetrated continuously, at scale, by specific identifiable people with specific identifiable interests. The righteous anger of a generation that feels its legitimate expectations are being denied is historically a rather more explosive force than the despair of one that expects nothing and has learned to live with that expectation. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the economic radicalization that preceded 1381. The 30 years between the Black Death and the Revolt were not years of static oppression. They were years of dynamic tension, in which the working population was slowly gaining ground against the suppressive weight of the statute of labourers, and in which each small gain generated both the appetite for more and the fear of losing what had been won. The poll tax threatened that trajectory. If the government could extract 3 to 4 days' wages from every adult in England on the basis of a flat per-person assessment, it did not particularly matter what wages had been slowly doing. Over the previous 3 decades, the gains could be absorbed and neutralised through direct fiscal extraction. The revolt was, among other things, a defence of hard-won economic territory against a specific and identifiable threat. This combination, a tax whose financial burden was genuinely severe, collected through methods that were experienced as personally degrading, for purposes that served the interests of a ruling class that had already been milking the countryside for decades, was the specific mechanism that converted the accumulated grievances of 30 years into direct action. The powder had been accumulating since 1348. The poll tax was the spark. What happened next was not spontaneous combustion. It was organised, deliberate, and aimed with considerable precision at the institutions and individuals that the rebels held responsible for their situation. Understanding that precision, and what it reveals about the political consciousness of the people who exercised it, is what makes the revolt of 1381 genuinely important rather than just historically dramatic. The powder had been building for 3 decades. The economic frustrations, the legal suppression of wages, the war taxes, the intrusive enforcement of labour laws, all of that was the long, slow accumulation described in the previous chapters. What turned that accumulation into an explosion was a specific sequence of events in the spring of 1381, driven by a specific fiscal instrument chosen by specific people for specific reasons and administered in ways that managed to be both financially crushing and personally humiliating simultaneously. This is, historically speaking, a fairly reliable recipe for disaster. The English government of 1381 followed it to the letter. To understand why the third poll tax was the instrument that finally broke things, it helps to understand the alternatives that were not chosen. Medieval English taxation was not a single uniform system. It had evolved over centuries into a complicated patchwork of different levies, assessments, and collection mechanisms, each with its own history, legal basis, and relationship to the various classes of people expected to pay. The most traditional form of direct taxation was the subsidy, a tax assessed on movable wealth, meaning goods, livestock, stored grain, and other tangible assets rated at a fraction of their estimated value. The subsidy had the theoretical advantage of being proportional. The wealthier you were, the more you paid. It also had the practical disadvantage of being fiendishly difficult to assess accurately, since people were not in the habit of helpfully cataloguing their movable assets for the convenience of royal commissioners, and the commissioners sent to assess them were local men who had their own relationships with the communities they were evaluating. The result was a system that was progressive in theory, and very often regressive in practice, since the powerful and well-connected managed their assessments with considerably more success than the poor and unconnected. Still, it at least gestured toward the principle that those with more should pay more, which was a principle the English population had not entirely abandoned. There were also indirect taxes, primarily customs duties on wool and cloth exports, which provided a substantial and relatively stable income stream that fell most directly on the merchant class engaged in international trade. These were politically easier to collect in the sense that they did not require armies of commissioners tramping through every village in the kingdom, but they were finite in their yield and insufficient to cover the increasingly astronomical costs of the French war during its expensive and fruitless later phases. The decision to introduce a poll tax, a flat per-person levy, was, in political terms, a choice to abandon the principle of proportionality in favour of administrative simplicity and maximum yield from the broadest possible base. Every adult in the kingdom was liable, regardless of what they owned or earned. The elderly widow with a small plot of land paid the same as the prosperous merchant with a warehouse full of cloth. The agricultural labourer who had managed, against the weight of the statute of labourers, to nudge his daily rate upward by a penny over the previous decade paid the same as the knight whose estate generated an income he could not have spent in a year of enthusiastic effort. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate design choice, and the people making it were not unaware of its regressive character. They simply did not regard that as a particularly significant objection. The first poll tax of 1377 charged 4 pence per adult. This was not trivial, but it was not catastrophic, either roughly a day and a half of wages for a skilled worker, painful but survivable. The government collected a substantial amount of money and simultaneously collected a substantial amount of resentment, though the resentment was not yet at the point of producing organised resistance. The second poll tax in 1379 attempted to address the equity problem by introducing a graduated scale based on social status. Earls paid 10 marks, esquires paid 20 shillings, common labourers paid 4 pence. This was more sophisticated in design and considerably more complicated to administer. The assessment of who qualified for which rate required local commissioners to make judgments about social status that were inherently subjective and highly contentious. The yield was disappointing, partly because the wealthy found ways to argue themselves into lower brackets, with an enthusiasm that would be entirely recognisable to any modern observer of how wealthy people approach their tax obligations. The third poll tax of 1381 was, in a sense, the government's frustrated response to both of these experiments. The 1377 tax had worked well financially, but generated resentment. The 1379 tax had attempted fairness, but produced inadequate revenue and administrative chaos. The solution arrived at was essentially to go back to the simple flat rate model, but charge 3 times as much, 12 pence per adult, 1 shilling. This was a formidable sum. For context, a skilled craftsman in 1381 might earn between 2 and 4 pence per day. An agricultural labourer might earn slightly less. For a household with several adult members, the combined tax liability could easily represent more than a week of total earnings, for a family that had almost certainly already been taxed in the same year through other mechanisms. The government did include a theoretical provision for the wealthy within a community to subsidise the payments of the poor, which was either a genuine gesture toward equity or a piece of political theatre depending on your level of cynicism. In practice, this provision was applied inconsistently at best and ignored entirely at worst, which tended toward confirming the more cynical interpretation. The men who designed this tax and pushed it through Parliament in November 1380 were not stupid people. They included some of the most experienced political operators in England, men who had been managing the relationship between Crown, Parliament, and population for decades. They knew the earlier poll taxes had generated resentment. They knew the population was already under fiscal stress from previous levies. They knew the war was going badly, and that the public credibility of the military enterprise they were funding had been declining for years. They chose to proceed anyway, which raises the obvious question of what exactly they were thinking. The answer is probably a combination of factors that add up to a collective failure of political judgment on a fairly impressive scale. The Treasury was genuinely under severe pressure. The French war was consuming money faster than the existing tax mechanisms could supply it. There was a calculation optimistic, as it turned out that the population would absorb another levy if the collection was handled competently. There was also, probably, a degree of aristocratic distance from the daily economic realities of peasant life that made 12 pence per person seem like a manageable inconvenience rather than a potentially explosive imposition. When you live in a palace with several hundred servants and your annual income is measured in hundreds of pounds, 12 pence is a rounding error. Extrapolating from your own economic experience to that of a farm labourer requires an imaginative effort that the medieval ruling class was not, on the whole, highly motivated to make. The political structure that produced the poll tax also deserves attention. Parliament in 1380, the body that formally granted the tax, was not representative in any modern sense of the word. The Commons, which theoretically represented the broader population, was composed of knights of the shire and burgesses from the towns, men of property whose economic interests were not identical to those of agricultural labourers, but who were certainly closer to them than the great lords. The fact that even this moderately more representative body agreed to the tax suggests that the parliamentary process was, at this point, not functioning as a genuine deliberative forum in which the interests of the tax population were meaningfully represented. It was functioning as a mechanism for formalising decisions that had effectively already been made by the Crown and its inner circle of advisers, which is a distinct and less useful thing. The specific management of the poll tax was delegated to the Parliament's own committee, which in turn appointed commissioners for each county. These commissioners were responsible for the actual assessment and collection process, and the quality of their work varied considerably across the kingdom. In some areas, collection proceeded without dramatic incident, which tells us something important. The grievance was real everywhere, but the specific trigger for open resistance required a specific kind of provocation on top of the underlying discontent. That provocation was most completely provided in the county of Essex, and understanding exactly what happened there is essential to understanding why 1381 unfolded the way it did. Essex in 1381 was economically sophisticated territory. Its proximity to London made it a region of active market agriculture, significant craft production, and a relatively mobile labour force that had benefited meaningfully from the post-plague labour market. The residents of Essex villages were not isolated rural communities with no knowledge of the wider world. They were people connected to London markets, aware of legal developments, and accustomed to the kind of practical economic negotiation that generates both organisational capability and a heightened sensitivity to encroachment on established economic territory. When the poll tax commissioners arrived in Essex in the spring of 1381, they were not dealing with a passive and uninformed population. They were dealing with people who had thought very carefully about what they owed and what they didn't. The initial collection attempts in Essex had produced returns that the central government found suspiciously low. Many communities appeared to have undergone a remarkable demographic contraction. In the weeks between the announcement of the tax and the arrival of the collectors, adults seemed to have simply vanished from the official count, hiding with relatives in other villages, being reported as younger than their actual age, or simply being collectively miscounted by local assessors who were not particularly motivated to squeeze their own neighbours on behalf of a distant government pursuing a distant war. This was tax evasion as community self-defence, practised with the coordination that 30 years of post-plague collective economic strategy had given these communities as a practical skill. It was, as evasion strategies go, fairly ingenious. It was also unfortunately noticed. The government's response was to send new commissioners into the counties that had returned suspiciously low numbers, with explicit authority to conduct fresh assessments and fill the gap between the original returns and the expected yield. These reassessment commissioners were operating under pressure. They had a target, a specific shortfall to recover, and they had the legal authority to be aggressive in their methods of achieving it. The combination of pressure, authority, and aggressive methodology produced the specific incidents that pushed Essex from passive evasion into active resistance. The physical examination of young women to determine their tax-eligible age was, even by the standards of the time, considered an outrage. The medieval household was understood as a semi-private space, particularly with regard to the female members of the family. The arrival of official strangers with authority to physically inspect daughters and younger female relatives crossed a line that was not primarily legal, but social and deeply personal. It violated the household honour in a way that the men of these communities experienced as a direct assault on their status and dignity, quite apart from the purely financial dimension of the tax. This was not simply about money. It was about a government's agents treating a family's women as objects to be examined and assessed like livestock in the household that was supposed to be the family's own protected space. The fury this generated was real, visceral, and immediate in a way that abstract fiscal grievance was not. There are several accounts from this period of specific confrontations between collectors and communities in the weeks before the revolt formally began, and while the details vary, the pattern is consistent. A commissioner arrives, he presents his authority and his assessment demand. The community objects either to the amount, the method, or both. The commissioner insists, either with genuine legal authority or with the kind of inflated sense of personal power that minor officials occasionally develop when given a badge and a mandate. The confrontation escalates. In most of these confrontations, the immediate outcome was still contained. The commissioner might be argued with, delayed, or even physically ejected from a particular house. But full-scale violent resistance had not yet begun. The incidents were building pressure rather than releasing it, adding to a community sense that the line between what could be tolerated and what could not was being approached. The specific incident that historians generally identify as the triggering event for the Essex Revolt occurred in late May or early June of 1381 in the town of Brentwood, when a royal commissioner named John Bampton arrived to conduct the reassessment of several Essex villages that had returned low tax counts. Bampton had come with explicit authority and with the legal backing of the Crown. He summoned representatives from the villages of Fobbing, Corringham, and Stanford-le-Hope to appear before him and answer for the gap between their initial returns and the expected numbers. The representatives appeared. What happened next was not what Bampton had planned. The men from Fobbing, led by someone whose name appears in various records as Thomas Baker, or Robert Belling, depending on which source you consult, and the uncertainty itself is revealing, since the historical record was kept by people who found it convenient not to be too specific about which individuals were responsible, flatly refused to pay any additional assessment. They had already paid what they owed, they said. The reassessment was invalid. They were leaving. Bampton threatened them with arrest. The threat did not produce the desired compliance. Instead, it produced something considerably more alarming. The men from the three villages effectively expelled Bampton from the town, with assistance that the historical sources describe with varying degrees of diplomatic vagueness, but which clearly involved the kind of physical persuasion that left the commissioner in no doubt about the seriousness of the community's position. Bampton retreated to London to report the situation to the Royal Council and request military support for a return to Essex. He got it, in the form of Robert Belknap, a judge who was sent into Essex with a commission to arrest the ringleaders of the Brentwood confrontation and hold a special court. This was the standard medieval government response to local disorder: send a judicial authority with teeth, identify the leaders, prosecute them, and make an example that discourages imitation elsewhere. It was a strategy that had worked before. It did not work in Essex in 1381. Belknap arrived in Essex and found that the situation had developed rather rapidly in the days since Bampton's expulsion. Word of the Brentwood confrontation had spread through the dense network of market-day communication and parish connections that link the Essex villages, and the response had been, in historical terms, extraordinary. Rather than the resistance collapsing as the government clearly expected, it had expanded. Other communities had joined. Men from multiple villages had converged, organising themselves with a speed and coherence that suggests both the pre-existing community structures and some prior planning that the historical record is understandably vague about. When Belknap arrived to conduct his court and arrest the Brentwood ringleaders, he found himself facing not a local incident, but an organised regional force. He was captured, forced to swear an oath that he would never again operate such a commission, had his legal files destroyed, and was sent home, which was, from the government's perspective, a considerably worse outcome than a successful prosecution would have been. Belknap survived and eventually returned to his career, though one imagines his enthusiasm for Essex commissions was permanently diminished. The destruction of Belknap's legal papers is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it reveals something important about the sophistication of what was happening. The people who forced Belknap to give up his documents and then destroyed them were not simply expressing rage. They were making a precise and legally informed point. The documents, the court commissions, the writs of arrest, the tax assessment rolls were the physical instruments of the legal authority that was being used against them. Destroying those documents did not just symbolically reject that authority, it practically undermined it. Without the documentation, the legal proceedings could not go forward. The evidence for who had done what could not be formally presented. The machinery of judicial prosecution required paper in exactly the way that a modern trial requires its procedural documentation, and the rebels understood this. They were not illiterate savages burning things in a frenzy. They were people who understood how the legal system worked and were targeting its operational requirements with deliberate precision. This pattern, targeting documentation, burning court rolls, destroying the physical records that encoded legal obligations, would repeat itself throughout the revolt across multiple counties. When rebels attacked manor houses, they very often went specifically for the record chests where the manorial documents were kept. The court rolls that recorded villain obligations, the surveys that identified who was bound and what they owed, the legal instruments that the lords used to enforce their claims in manorial courts. These were destroyed with an intentionality that speaks to a clear-eyed understanding of how the system of exploitation actually functioned. Take away the paperwork, and you take away a substantial portion of the legal basis for the lord's claims. It was, as a strategy, elegant in its directness. The medieval legal system ran on documentation in much the way that modern bureaucracy runs on databases, and the rebels were essentially trying to crash the database. Meanwhile, across the Thames estuary, Kent was developing its own version of the Essex crisis. Kent was in some respects even more economically developed than Essex, with significant involvement in the wool trade, a population accustomed to movement and commercial activity, and a tradition of legal assertiveness about customary rights that traced back through generations of manorial court battles. The poll tax had been equally hated in Kent, and the collection methods had been equally intrusive. The news from Essex reached Kent quickly, and it fell on ground that was already prepared. The Kentish Rebellion, which would ultimately produce the most famous names of the entire revolt, began in a different way and with different immediate triggers than the Essex Rising, but it joined the same stream of organised resistance within days. The organisation that emerged in Kent in the first days of June 1381 demonstrated characteristics that simply cannot be explained by spontaneous mass anger. Large numbers of men from multiple communities were converging, moving in coordinated fashion, maintaining enough internal discipline to distinguish between targets, and selecting those targets with a specificity that required prior knowledge and deliberate planning. They attacked specific properties associated with specific officials and specific legal instruments. They left other properties alone. They were not burning everything in sight. They were burning specific things, the legal records, the buildings of specific hated administrators, the symbols of specific institutional authority. This selectivity is the tell. Mobs do not select. Organised movements with a programme select, and the rebels of 1381 were selecting with a precision that speaks to preparation, communication, and shared political purpose. The speed with which the rising spread to other counties in early June is also, on reflection, surprising in ways that the standard account tends to smooth over. Within days of the Brentwood confrontation, coordinated action was underway not just in Essex and Kent, but in Hertfordshire, Suffolk, Norfolk, and eventually across a much wider swathe of England. The conventional explanation that news spread naturally through trading networks and the various mechanisms of oral communication is correct as far as it goes, but it understates the organisational preconditions required for the news to produce coordinated action rather than isolated local incidents. People who hear that their neighbours have resisted the tax collector do not automatically form regional armies with shared programmes of demands. Something more was going on, a pre-existing network of communication and coordination, a set of prior relationships and agreements that the Brentwood incident activated rather than created from scratch. The historical evidence for exactly what that network consisted of is fragmentary, because the people who knew the details had every reason to ensure that the details were not written down in any discoverable form. But the speed and coordination of the revolt's spread is hard to explain without it. The poll tax also generated resistance in the towns, not just the countryside, and the urban dimension of the revolt is often underemphasised. London itself was a city under considerable economic stress. In 1381, the disruptions of the plague decades had reshuffled the urban economic hierarchy in ways that left significant numbers of artisans and small tradespeople in precarious positions, and the poll tax fell on them with the same flat-rate brutality that it brought to the countryside. The urban poor of London had their own relationship to the legal apparatus of municipal government, which was dominated by a relatively small number of wealthy merchant families who controlled the major guilds and through them the city's political and economic life. The resentments this generated in the broader urban population were not identical to the rural grievances around villein status and labour law, but they rhymed with them in important ways. When the rural rebels marched on London, they found a city that was not entirely hostile to their arrival, for reasons that had as much to do with London's internal politics as with solidarity across the urban-rural divide. The specific legal mechanism of the poll tax also intersected in interesting ways with the question of who was actually liable. The legislation that established the 1381 tax defined liability as applying to all lay adults above the age of 15, with exemptions for the genuinely destitute. The exemption for the destitute was a concession to political optics rather than a practical commitment, since defining who qualified as genuinely destitute and having that definition applied honestly required both a precise standard and incorruptible local administration, neither of which was reliably available. In practice, the exemption was applied inconsistently, with the result that some communities found their poorest members included in the levy, while others managed to claim broader exemptions. This inconsistency added another layer of perceived arbitrary injustice to a tax that was already widely regarded as fundamentally unfair. The clergy were exempt from the poll tax. As they were from most forms of direct royal taxation, they paid their own taxation through separate ecclesiastical mechanisms and had successfully defended this exemption for centuries. This was entirely consistent with the legal traditions of the English Church, but was not, from the perspective of agricultural labourers who were paying 12 pence per head, entirely satisfying. The people who arguably had the most secure income, the most robust institutional support, and the least vulnerability to economic fluctuation were exempt, while those with the least security paid the same absolute amount as those with rather more. The logic of this arrangement required a degree of acceptance of hierarchical principles that the post-plague generation was finding increasingly difficult to maintain. The period between the Brentwood confrontation in late May and the convergence of rebel forces on London in mid-June 1381 was, in many ways, the most fascinating and under-examined phase of the entire revolt. These were the days when what had started as tax resistance in specific communities transformed into a regional movement with a political program and a destination. The decisions made during this period about who to target, what to demand, where to march, were not made by desperate people reacting blindly to immediate pressure. They were made by people engaged in genuine political deliberation, using the communication networks and organisational structures that 30 years of post-plague collective action had given them. The demands that emerge from this deliberative process are themselves revealing of the movement's political sophistication. The abolition of the poll tax was the obvious immediate demand, but the rebels were not limiting themselves to tax policy. They wanted the Statute of Labourers repealed permanently. They wanted villein tenure abolished and replaced with free tenure at a standard low rent, making all agricultural workers free men in the legal sense. They wanted the right to buy and sell freely in any market in the kingdom, without guild restrictions or monopoly tolls. They wanted a general pardon for all actions taken during the revolt. These were not the demands of a mob. They were a coherent programme for the economic and legal transformation of English society, focused precisely on the specific mechanisms through which the ruling class had maintained its advantages against the pressure of post-plague economic change. Whoever formulated these demands had a detailed, technically accurate understanding of the legal structures they were targeting. They were not attacking the feudal system in the abstract. They were attacking its specific operational components with surgical precision. The role of the poll tax commissioners, who were specifically sought out and killed during the revolt, is also revealing in this respect. Among the primary targets were individuals who had been particularly aggressive in their collection methods, particularly prominent in the enforcement of labour laws, or particularly associated with the legal apparatus for maintaining villein status. These were not random choices. They were the product of community knowledge accumulated over years of manorial court confrontations and labour law prosecutions, translated into a specific list of institutional enemies. The rebels knew who had wronged them, remembered it, and in the extraordinary circumstances of June 1381, acted on that institutional memory. This is not the behaviour of people who have simply snapped under intolerable pressure. This is the behaviour of people who have been keeping very careful score. The question of violence during the revolt deserves careful treatment, because the historical memory of 1381 has been somewhat distorted by the dramatic events in London, which we will come to in full detail, and by the natural tendency of the chroniclers, who were almost uniformly members of the social classes threatened by the revolt, to emphasise the most alarming incidents and frame everything as undifferentiated chaos. The reality was considerably more complex. Property was destroyed on a large scale, particularly legal documents and buildings associated with hated officials. A number of specific individuals were killed, primarily those identified as particular enemies of the rebel cause. But the vast majority of property encountered along the routes of march was left untouched. Churches were generally respected. The property of ordinary townspeople and farmers was not systematically plundered. The rebels were making political points, not conducting a general war against everything around them, and the selectivity of their actions reflects the political consciousness that shaped them throughout. The moment the poll tax became a trigger rather than simply a grievance was the moment the government compounded its initial error with a follow-up error of attempting aggressive reassessment rather than backing down. Had the Royal Council, when Bampton returned from Brentwood with his tale of humiliation, decided to quietly write off the shortfall and move on, history might have taken a different course. The fiscal pressure was real, but so were the alternatives the government could have borrowed, negotiated, or simply accepted a lower yield from the tax rather than pushing for reassessment in the face of obvious community resistance. Instead, it chose escalation. It sent Belknap with his judicial commission to make an example, and the example it made was not the one it intended. The rebellion that followed was not the inevitable product of 30 years of accumulated grievance acting on its own momentum. It was the specific product of 30 years of accumulated grievance meeting a government too rigid, too distant from the realities of the countryside, and too committed to its own authority to recognise when pushing harder was going to push back. The cart was rolling. It had gathered a momentum that no individual decision could easily arrest, and it was pointed with remarkable precision at London and the men who governed England from behind its walls. What would happen when it arrived there, the demands made, the alliances forged? The extraordinary scenes at Smithfield is the next chapter of a story that has been 3 decades and 3 poll taxes in the making. The Brentwood confrontation and its immediate aftermath already covered in the previous chapter established the pattern. What this chapter is concerned with is something both larger and more subtle. How that pattern replicated itself across 2 counties, then 6, then a dozen, in the space of a few weeks, and what that replication tells us about the extraordinary organisational capacity of people who, according to the standard historical narrative, should not have been capable of organising anything more complex than a harvest schedule. Kent in early June 1381 was running a parallel track to Essex, and the 2 tracks converged with a speed that has impressed historians ever since, or at least the ones who have been paying attention to the logistics rather than just the drama. The Kentish Rising had its own specific triggers, its own cast of local characters, and its own initial targets, but it was drawing on the same deep well of accumulated grievance and the same community infrastructure that made coordinated action possible. If Essex was the match, Kent was the other match, and what they jointly lit was considerably larger than either could have produced alone. The geography of Kent mattered. The county was uniquely positioned in medieval England in ways that shaped both its economic character and its political culture. Situated between London and the Channel ports, Kent was a corridor through which an extraordinary volume of traffic moved merchants, pilgrims heading to Canterbury, soldiers embarking for France, wool shipments heading to Flemish markets, royal messengers, diplomats, and the general commercial flow of a major trading nation. The people who lived and worked in this corridor were, by the standards of the time, unusually well informed about events in the wider world. They heard things, they talked. They had more regular contact with people from beyond their immediate community than inland agricultural populations, and that contact was a conduit for information, ideas, and a certain comparative awareness of how other places did things. The Kentish peasantry was also, in important respects, legally distinct from peasants in many other parts of England. The custom of gavelkind, the traditional Kentish inheritance practice by which land was divided equally among all sons, rather than passing entirely to the eldest, had created a landscape of smaller, more numerous holdings, and a peasant population with a stronger practical relationship to individual land ownership than in counties where primogeniture concentrated inherited land and created starker divisions between those who held and those who worked for those who held. The result was a community that was, on average, more economically independent and more legally conscious than the feudal ideal might suggest. Kentish villagers had been arguing their customary rights in courts for generations, and they had developed something of a tradition of collective legal assertion that gave them both a vocabulary and a practice base for organised resistance. The transition from collective legal action to collective political action, while not trivial, was considerably shorter in Kent than it might have been elsewhere. There is also the matter of Kent's particular relationship with the mechanisms of royal government. As the gateway county between London and the Channel ports, Kent hosted more than its share of royal officials, tax commissioners, customs officers, military impressment agents, and the general administrative apparatus of a state that needed to manage its primary maritime connection to the continent. The Kentish population had, as a result, considerably more direct and regular contact with the day-to-day operations of royal government than most inland agricultural communities. This familiarity bred not exactly contempt, or not only contempt but a detailed and highly specific knowledge of how the system worked, who its local representatives were, what powers they actually held and what powers they merely claimed, and where the operational gaps in their authority were located. When the time came to act, the people of Kent were not guessing at the anatomy of the system they were challenging. They had been watching it operate in their own villages and market towns for years, and they had formed some fairly precise views about its weaknesses. The specific officials who became primary targets in Kent during the first days of the Rising were not chosen arbitrarily. They were people whose names had accumulated a particular weight of community grievance men who had been notably aggressive in their poll tax assessments, who had prosecuted labour law violations with unusual enthusiasm, or who had used their official positions to pursue personal advantage in ways that the local population had noticed and resented. The selectivity of the targeting was not, as the hostile chronicles suggested, a thin veneer of organisation over underlying chaos. It was the primary feature of what was happening, a community-level settling of accounts with specific identified enemies, conducted with the kind of careful targeting that only works when you actually know who you are targeting and why. Medieval villages were small. Everybody knew everybody. The idea that the identities of the most aggressive local officials were unclear to the communities they had been oppressing is, on reflection, fairly implausible. The figure who emerges most prominently from the Kentish Rising is, of course, Wat Tyler, and we will devote a full chapter to him shortly, because he deserves more than a brief mention here. But the Kentish movement did not begin with Wat Tyler. It began with communities, with village assemblies and market day conversations and the rapid spread of news from Essex that fell on ground already prepared by local grievances. By the time Tyler emerged as the dominant leader of the Kentish forces, the movement was already underway. He was chosen to lead something that had already decided it was going somewhere. The direction was London, and the reason was simple. The power that needed to be confronted was there, and the men who needed to answer for the poll tax were there, and there was a young king there who might the rebels genuinely hope to listen to people he had never been obliged to hear before. The routes of march from Essex and Kent toward London are themselves instructive. The Essex rebels moved through the river valleys and market towns of the county, collecting adherents as they went and targeting specific properties along the route, particularly the manors and legal offices of men who had been particularly associated with poll tax enforcement or labour law prosecution. The Kentish forces marched along the road from Canterbury through Rochester and Dartford toward London Bridge. Both groups moved with a discipline that contemporary observers noted with a mixture of admiration and alarm, which is not the response that a disorganised mob typically generates. The chronicles of the period written by monks, court officials and churchmen who were not remotely sympathetic to the rebels and had every interest in emphasising their dangerous savagery, nevertheless cannot quite suppress the evidence that these were organised forces rather than chaotic crowds. The population that joined the march as it moved through each county was not uniform. The rebels drew from across the social spectrum of the rural working world. Substantial freeholders who held their land outright and owed no villein service were there, motivated primarily by the tax burden and the labour law restrictions on the workers they employed or competed with. Craftsmen from the small towns, smiths, carpenters, weavers, tanners brought their own grievances about guild restrictions and market access. Agricultural labourers carrying the full weight of villein tenure had the most fundamental legal grievances, and they marched with the particular intensity of people for whom the abstract demand for freedom was actually about their own daily lives. Former soldiers who had served in France and come back to find that the kingdom they had fought for was still happy to tax them, while refusing to improve their legal status, were present in significant numbers, and they brought the organisational experience already mentioned a practical knowledge of how to move large groups of men, maintain supply, and sustain morale over days of difficult marching. There were also, and this is important, men of somewhat higher social standing than the typical image of the revolt accommodates. Minor officials, lesser clergy who disagreed with their institutional superiors about the church's economic behaviour, and even the occasional smaller landowner whose interests were not entirely aligned with the great lords above them. All of these appeared in and around the marching forces in roles that varied from active participant to sympathetic facilitator. The revolt was not a uniform uprising of the lowest against all above them. It was a coalition, messy and sometimes internally contradictory as all coalitions are, united by specific shared grievances rather than a single social position. The coalition held together because the specific targets of rebel anger, the poll tax, the labour laws, the legal architecture of villein status were genuinely hated across a wide range of social positions, even if they were hated for somewhat different reasons by different participants. The question of communication between the Essex and Kent rebels during the days of March is one that the historical record addresses only obliquely, because the people involved had every reason to ensure their coordination methods were not documented in ways that could be used against them afterward. What we can say with confidence is that the two forces arrived at the approaches to London within hours of each other, in ways that are very difficult to explain as coincidence, and that their subsequent actions showed a degree of mutual awareness that implies at minimum some channel of communication during the march. Whether this was through designated messengers, prearranged signals, or simply the rapid flow of information through the same market and parish networks that had served as the organisational substrate of the movement from the beginning, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that whatever mechanism was used, it worked. The logistics of the entire operation were, by the standards of medieval popular movements, remarkably competent. The spread of the rebellion beyond Essex and Kent to Suffolk, Norfolk, Hertfordshire, Cambridge, and eventually to points considerably further afield, happened faster than any central direction could have organised it, which tells us something important. The rebellion did not spread because Essex and Kent sent organisers to the other counties. It spread because those counties were ready, because they had their own versions of the same grievances and the same community structures, and because the news from the southeast arrived as permission rather than instruction. The people of Suffolk did not need to be told what to do. They already knew what they wanted and how to organise to pursue it. They needed only the confirmation that elsewhere in England others were already moving, which is a psychological catalyst of considerable power. There is something about the knowledge that you're not alone, that the risk you're taking is being shared across a wide geography, that transforms the personal calculus of whether to act. The Suffolk and Norfolk risings are often treated as secondary to the Essex and Kent events, partly because they did not produce the same famous names, and partly because the London events naturally dominate the narrative. But the geographic spread is itself the story, and what happened in the eastern counties illuminates dimensions of the revolt that the London focus tends to obscure. In these counties, the specific targets reflected specific local grievances that overlapped with, but were not identical to the issues driving the Essex and Kent rebels. The great monastic establishments of the region Bury St Edmunds, in particular, were among the primary targets, and the grievances against them were a specific version of the general complaint about institutional power. The monasteries were major landowners, major employers of agricultural labour, and enthusiastic users of the manorial court system to enforce villein obligations and protect their economic interests. The spiritual authority the monasteries claimed was in obvious tension with their economic behaviour, and the rebels of Suffolk had been watching that tension play out in their own lives for years. The prior of Bury St Edmunds had spent considerable energy in the years before 1381 attempting to reassert monastic control over the town of Bury, whose residents claimed ancient liberties that the monastery disputed. The legal battle had been ongoing for decades, consuming money and generating bitterness on both sides, with the monks generally having the better of the legal argument and the townspeople having the more justified moral case. When the rebellion arrived in Bury in June 1381, it landed on a community that had a very specific, legally sophisticated, long-documented grievance against a specific institutional enemy. The actions taken against the monastery were not random violence. They were the settlement of a particular account that had been running for a long time. This specificity, the way in which the revolt in each location expressed and targeted the particular local configuration of power and grievance, is one of the things that makes 1381 remarkable as a historical event, and that the single narrative approach to the revolt tends to smooth over. In Cambridge, the rebels targeted the university with a specificity that tells its own story. The university was not just an educational institution. It was a legal entity with its own courts, its own economic privileges, and its own history of extracting advantages from the town and the surrounding countryside in ways that the local population found deeply objectionable. The town versus gown conflict in medieval Cambridge was not simply a matter of students and locals having different tastes in Saturday night entertainment. It was a structural conflict about legal jurisdiction, economic rights, and the privileges that the university's royal charters gave it over the community in which it sat. When rebels burned university records in Cambridge in June 1381, they were targeting the institutional embodiment of a local power imbalance, just as their counterparts in Essex had targeted the court records of the manorial system, and their counterparts in Suffolk had targeted the monastery's documentation of their legal claims. This consistency of method across very different local contexts is, when you sit with it, one of the most striking features of the whole movement. People in dozens of different communities, acting with minimal central coordination, independently identified the same strategic priority: destroy the records. The fact that this priority surfaced so consistently across such a wide geographic spread suggests that it was not improvised locally, but was part of a shared understanding of how the legal system works and how to undermine it. That shared understanding did not appear from nowhere. It was the product of a common experience of manorial courts, of labour law prosecutions, of the way in which legal documentation was used to define and enforce obligations that had given a very large number of people a very clear idea of which specific things needed to go. The leadership structure that emerged from the Kentish and Essex movements as they coalesced into the March on London was informal by later political standards, but functional in the specific context. Wat Tyler was the most prominent name, but he was not a commander in the military sense of someone who issued orders that were simply followed. He was a leader in the sense that the movement recognized him as its most effective voice and most authoritative representative, which is a different and in some ways more interesting thing. His authority rested on a combination of personal presence, organizational credibility, and the consent of the people who marched with him, not on any formal commission or prior rank. The distinction matters because it tells us something about the political culture of the movement. It was fundamentally participatory in its governance, choosing leaders for their demonstrated usefulness, rather than their hereditary status or institutional position. This was, in the context of 14th century England, a genuinely radical organizational principle, even if no one at the time was likely formulating it in those terms. The Kentish forces took Rochester Castle along the route to London, not through direct assault since they had no siege equipment, but through the castle's garrison deciding that the strategic situation made resistance unwise, which is a polite way of saying that the garrison looked at the size of the approaching force and concluded that their job description did not specifically include dying for a tax dispute. The castle's gates were opened, prisoners inside were released including, in some accounts, a specific individual whose imprisonment was connected to labour law prosecutions, which again speaks to the movement's political targeting, and the rebels moved on. The taking of Rochester was important not just militarily, but symbolically. It demonstrated that organised popular force could move through the landscape of royal power without being stopped by its physical infrastructure. The castles and fortifications that dotted the English countryside existed primarily to overawe the population around them. When that overawing effect failed, the physical obstacle they presented was considerably more negotiable than the symbolism implied. The march on London from both directions took several days, and those days were not simply the physical process of getting from one place to another. They were days of continuing political development. Communities along the routes of march made decisions about whether to join, to stay neutral, or to actively resist, and the vast majority made the calculation that the march represented something legitimate enough, and dangerous enough if opposed, that active resistance was not a sensible option. Local lords who might have organised opposition largely did not, partly from practical inability to assemble sufficient force on short notice, partly from a calculation that the rebels' programme did not, in its stated form, actually threaten their fundamental interests as much as it threatened the Crown's administrators and the institutional church, and partly from the same political reading of the situation that the Rochester garrison had made. This is not the moment to make a stand. The supplies that fed the marching forces came from a combination of sources. Some communities along the route provided food voluntarily, either from sympathy or from the entirely sensible assessment that feeding the rebels was preferable to annoying them. Some property was commandeered from the estates of specifically targeted individuals. Very little appears to have been simply taken from neutral parties. The discipline around provisioning, imperfect as it necessarily was for a force of this size moving fast, reflects the same political consciousness that shaped the movement's targeting throughout. Robbing the people you are marching to liberate is not a great recruitment strategy, and the movement seems to have understood this, which is another small detail that sits awkwardly with the image of mindless mob violence. The internal governance of the marching forces is worth thinking about carefully, because it presented challenges that any modern event organiser would recognise with a wince. Moving tens of thousands of people over several days, keeping them fed, maintaining enough internal discipline to prevent the kind of random violence that would have alienated potential allies, and given the government the justification it needed for a military crackdown, all of this required ongoing coordination and authority that could not be imposed from outside, but had to come from within the movement itself. The mechanism was, as far as we can reconstruct it, a combination of the authority of recognised leaders like Tyler, the social cohesion of the village and community groups that had joined together and maintained their internal solidarity during the march, and the shared understanding of the movement's goals that gave people a common standard by which to evaluate proposed actions. When someone wanted to burn a barn that was not on the target list, the restraint that prevented it came not from a police force, but from the peer judgment of fellow marchers who understood what the movement was for and what it was not for. This is a remarkably sophisticated form of collective self-governance, and it largely worked, which is not nothing. There is a quality to the march on London that is easy to miss in the dramatic account, and that is worth pausing on. These were people who had, for the most part, never been to London. For many of them, the march was the furthest they had ever travelled from their home villages. Medieval travel was not comfortable, quick, or cheap, and the horizon of most agricultural workers' physical world was defined by how far they could reasonably walk and return in a day from their homes. Marching to London took you out of the known world and into something considerably more uncertain and strange. The fact that so many people made this choice abandoned the familiarity and relative safety of their communities to march toward the most powerful city in England and demand an audience with their king is a measure of how seriously they were taking the moment and how completely they had concluded that the normal channels of redress were not going to serve them. The mood of the marching forces, as far as it can be reconstructed from hostile contemporary accounts and subsequent oral tradition, was not the savage desperation that the chronicles wanted to portray. There was anger, certainly, and there was a determined readiness to take actions that would have been unthinkable in normal circumstances. But there was also, by several accounts, something closer to a carnival atmosphere alongside the serious political purpose singing declarations of loyalty to the king, a point worth emphasizing. The rebels consistently claimed to be acting in the king's name, not against him, and a spirit of community fellowship that came from the extraordinary experience of thousands of people finding themselves, for once, acting collectively rather than individually against a system that had always isolated them in their individual vulnerability. This was not, for most of the marchers, a death march. It was, at least at the beginning, something closer to a liberation march, in the specific sense of people who have been defined by their subjugation discovering, in the act of collective movement, that the definition is no longer entirely binding. The loyalty to the young King Richard II, consistently expressed throughout the rebellion's early phases, is a dimension of the revolt that deserves more attention than it usually receives. Richard was 14 years old in 1381, having inherited the throne as a child, and he had not yet had time to accumulate the specific personal grievances that the rebels nursed against John of Gaunt and the various ministers and commissioners who had administered the poll tax. More importantly, from the rebels' political perspective, framing their demands as petitions to a king who was being badly advised by corrupt ministers was a strategically brilliant position. It was simultaneously sincere. Many of the rebels genuinely held a kind of idealized loyalty to the crown as a concept, even as they despised the men who exercised power in its name and strategically useful, since it drew a sharp line between the king, who could theoretically grant their demands, and the king's servants, who were the specific targets of rebel anger. This framing made the rebels' program into a conservative restoration rather than a radical revolution. They were not attacking the crown, they were asking the crown to clean house. Whether the crown saw it that way was a different question, as events would demonstrate. But as a political position, it was more sophisticated than burn everything down, and it reflected a genuine understanding of how to present demands in a way that maximized the possibility of a favourable response. The political target was precise. The rebels' grievances, as we have established, were specific: the poll tax, the statute of labourers, the legal architecture of villain status. Their targets in London would prove equally specific: the destruction of the Savoy Palace. John of Gaunt's magnificent London residence was chosen not because it was the nearest large building to burn, but because John of Gaunt was the most visible symbol of the governing class that had produced the tax and the war. The attack on the legal records at the Inns of Court was chosen because those records were the technical infrastructure of the legal apparatus the rebels were fighting. The specific officials sought and killed were identified by name, for specific reasons connected to specific actions they had taken in the prosecution of labour laws and tax collection. This was organised political action, conducted with a clarity of purpose that the chronicle accounts do their best to bury under dramatic descriptions of chaos, but cannot entirely suppress. The arrival of the rebels at the approaches to London on the 12th and 13th of June created a situation that the city's government was entirely unprepared for, despite having had several days of warning that the forces were coming. The mayor and aldermen of London faced a city with an internal population whose sympathies were divided. The poorer inhabitants of the city's wards had their own grievances against the merchant oligarchy that controlled London's government, and there was no guarantee that the city's defences would hold even if the will to man them was present. The gates were, in the end, opened accounts differ on exactly how and exactly by whom, and the rebels entered London in the early hours of June 13th. What happened in the city over the following days was one of the most extraordinary episodes in English medieval history, and it deserves its own full chapter. The decision to open the London gates, or the failure to keep them firmly shut, depending on how you read the sources, was not a simple administrative lapse. London Bridge, the only fixed crossing of the Thames in that period, and therefore the primary entry point from Kent, was a fortifiable position that a determined defence could have held against a force without siege equipment for a considerable time. The fact that it was not held tells us something important about the internal politics of London at that particular moment. The city was not a monolith. It was a community with its own class divisions, its own political factions, and its own population of people who had reasons to be sympathetic to at least some of what the rebels were demanding. The wealthy merchant families who dominated the Common Council had their own reasons to fear a force that was openly hostile to the poll tax and the ministers associated with it, but the journeymen, apprentices, and casual labourers who made up the majority of London's working population had considerably less invested in defending the gates against people who were marching, among other things, against the statute of labourers that kept their own wages suppressed. There is also a specifically London political angle involving John of Gaunt that shaped the city's response to the approaching rebels. John of Gaunt was genuinely unpopular in London for reasons that went beyond his general association with the French War's failures. He had been involved in a lengthy dispute with the city's governing authorities about commercial privileges and jurisdictional rights, and his relationship with London's mercantile elite was hostile in ways that meant his enemies within the city were not entirely displeased to see forces arriving whose primary target was his palace. Politics in medieval London, as in most places at most times, was not a matter of clear alignment between institutional defenders and popular challengers. It was considerably messier than that, and the messy internal politics of London in June 1381 created openings that a more unified city might not have provided. The figures within London who facilitated the rebels' entry, whether by opening gates, failing to organise defence, or actively guiding the arriving forces toward their targets, remain a subject of historical debate, partly because the subsequent official account had every incentive to minimise the extent of internal collaboration and present the city's falling to the rebels as the result of overwhelming external force rather than internal division. That official version was useful politically in the aftermath, because acknowledging that significant numbers of London's own residents had welcomed or assisted the rebels would have complicated the story of an orderly government overcoming chaos. The messy truth, as usual, was sacrificed for a cleaner narrative. History, unfortunately, tends not to get a vote on this process. But before we move there, it is worth standing back for a moment and noting what had actually been achieved in the few weeks between the Brentwood confrontation and the entry into London. A regional tax dispute had become a national movement. Communities across a dozen counties had coordinated around a shared programme. An organised force of tens of thousands had marched hundreds of miles to the capital without dissolving into chaos or being dispersed by the Crown's forces. A set of political demands had been formulated that addressed the specific legal mechanisms of an entrenched system of exploitation with technical precision, and a 14-year-old king was about to find himself in a situation that no amount of royal protocol had prepared him for. The people who were supposed to be at the bottom of everything had arrived at the top of the agenda, and the governing class of England was about to discover that the organisational capacity they had spent 30 years trying to suppress had developed, in those 30 years, into something considerably more formidable than they had imagined possible. Before the rebels entered London, before the gates swung open, before any of the dramatic confrontations that would make June 1381 one of the most discussed weeks in English medieval history, there was a voice. Not a new voice, as it happens. A voice that had been preaching the same essential message for the better part of 20 years, that had been imprisoned for it multiple times, that had been formally silenced by the institutional church on so many occasions that the church had developed something of a specialist familiarity with the problem. The voice belonged to John Ball, and understanding it, what he said, why it resonated, and what exactly made the authorities so persistently determined to shut him up, is essential to understanding why the revolt of 1381 was not just a tax protest, but a movement with a coherent vision of what a more just world might look like. John Ball was, in the technical language of the time, a hedge preacher, meaning he was a priest who operated outside the formal parish structure, preaching in fields and market squares and wherever else people would gather to hear him, without the authorization of a bishop or the institutional backing of a parish appointment. The category of hedge preacher was not unusual in itself. Medieval England had a long tradition of itinerant religious figures who moved through the countryside offering a kind of spiritual service that the formal parish system, with its fixed geographical boundaries and its tendency to produce clergy more interested in collecting tithes than in actually interacting with their parishioners, did not always provide. Wandering friars from the Franciscan and Dominican orders had made this kind of popular itinerant ministry their institutional specialty. The difference between a licensed friar preaching in the countryside and an unlicensed hedge preacher doing essentially the same thing was, from the perspective of the people listening, fairly academic. From the perspective of the institutional church, however, it was the difference between controlled and uncontrolled speech, which is a distinction that ecclesiastical authorities have always found significant. Bull had, at some point in his early career, been a priest with at least minimal institutional standing, possibly a chantry priest, one of the lower clergy employed to say masses for the souls of wealthy patrons, a job that provided a modest income and minimal institutional oversight, but also minimal advancement and minimal opportunity for the kind of active engagement with communities that Bull clearly sought. Whatever his precise starting point, he had by the 1360s developed into a fully itinerant figure with no fixed parish and no institutional affiliation that could be easily controlled, which was the combination most likely to attract official attention and least likely to benefit from official protection. This was, in the ecclesiastical law of the time, irregular at best and heretical at worst, depending on what he was actually saying. Bull had been saying things for long enough and persistently enough that the Church's position had moved considerably toward the heretical end of that spectrum. He had been excommunicated, formally expelled from the community of the faithful, which in medieval terms was a serious spiritual penalty as well as a social one on at least one occasion. He had been imprisoned in the Archbishop of Canterbury's jail in Maidstone at the time the Kent Revolt began, which is where the rebels found him when they stormed it and freed all the prisoners. This detail has a certain narrative elegance that even hostile chroniclers found difficult to suppress. The man whose ideas had helped inspire the uprising was himself in prison for those ideas when the uprising arrived to release him. History occasionally has a sense of timing. The question of what exactly John Bull had been preaching for 20 years, and why it generated such persistent institutional anxiety, requires spending a moment with the intellectual content of his message, because the easy dismissal that he was a dangerous rabble-rouser who inflamed the peasants with irresponsible ideas misses something important about the tradition he was drawing on and the specific way in which his message was both orthodox and deeply subversive at the same time. Medieval Christian theology had always contained within it a tension that the institutional church managed with varying degrees of success. On one hand, the church taught that the social hierarchy, king, lord, peasant, was divinely ordained, a natural order reflecting God's plan for human society. The sermons delivered from the comfortable pulpits of prosperous parishes regularly reinforced this message. Accept your station, fulfill your obligations, and your reward will come in the next life, which will be organized on rather different principles than this one. On the other hand, the same theology that endorsed social hierarchy also insisted on the fundamental spiritual equality of all human souls before God. The rich man and the poor man were equally God's children. The souls of serfs were not worth less in heaven than the souls of lords. Christ himself had been born in poverty, and had chosen to spend his ministry among the lowest of the low, which was not, when you thought carefully about it, a detail that fitted neatly into a theology of divinely ordained hierarchy. Bull thought carefully about it. He had been thinking carefully about it for a very long time. And the question he kept asking in various forms, in various venues, to various crowds of people who had generally not been invited by the institutional church to think about it at all was this: if all human beings share a common spiritual dignity, if Adam and Eve were the ancestors of every person alive, if no one came into this world with a deed of land tucked under their arm, then where exactly did the Lord's rights come from? Not from God, who created all people equally, not from nature, which made no distinction between a nobleman's infant and a serf's. The only honest answer was that the distinctions came from human law and human power, and if they came from human law and human power, They could be changed by human law and human power or, in sufficiently extreme circumstances, by the direct action of the people those distinctions disadvantaged. The theological formulation of this argument, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, was not original to Bull. It was a preaching trope that had circulated in various forms through the tradition of popular religious discourse for decades before 1381. What Bull did with it was give it a specifically political edge, connect it to specific contemporary grievances, and preach it with sufficient persistence and passion to keep it alive and circulating in communities that needed a theological vocabulary for the arguments their economic experience was already generating. The church could throw him in jail, and did. What it could not do was unthink the question for the people who had heard it, which is the fundamental problem with questions that are obviously correct. The institutional church's response to Bull and preachers like him illuminates something important about the relationship between religious authority and social control in medieval England. The church had a genuine theological problem with Bull's arguments, not just a political one, or rather, the theological and political problems were so thoroughly intertwined that separating them was essentially impossible. If you accepted the theological premise, all souls are equal before God, and followed the logic, therefore earthly social distinctions are not divinely ordained but humanly constructed, you arrived at conclusions that were incompatible with the social structure that the church itself depended on to maintain its own enormous wealth and institutional power. A church that owned between a quarter and a third of England's land and employed thousands of agricultural labourers under exactly the same villain tenure arrangements that applied on secular estates was not in a strong position to enthusiastically endorse the theological argument for the abolition of serfdom. The Church's suppression of Bull was, from this angle, not entirely a disinterested pursuit of doctrinal purity. It was also the self-interested management of an argument that pointed as uncomfortably at archbishops as at earls. Bull's specific genius, if we want to call it that, was to make his message both accessible and impossible to dismiss on purely rational grounds, within the theological framework that everyone in medieval England shared. He was not proposing something alien. He was drawing out an implication of what the Church itself had always taught, and his audience was entirely capable of following the logic. The peasant who had sat through dozens of sermons about spiritual equality and the irrelevance of earthly status to heavenly reward was perfectly equipped to notice the gap between that spiritual equality and the labour laws that kept him legally suppressed. Bull was not introducing a new idea from outside. He was connecting dots that were already there within the shared intellectual and theological world of his audience. The letter attributed to Bull circulated among communities before the revolt began, and preserved in the chronicles partly because the chroniclers found it alarming enough to, quote, gives a flavour of how he communicated. It was written in a compressed, riddling style that could be read innocuously by hostile eyes while carrying a clear message to those already primed to receive it. It spoke of a great gathering of people seeking their rights, of standing together and not being afraid, of doing what needed to be done before the moment passed. The encoded quality of the language tells you something about the practical conditions under which this communication was happening. Bull had been repeatedly imprisoned for straightforward speech, and had learned, as people in those circumstances often do, to develop a mode of communication that could travel under official radar while carrying its essential content to the intended audience. It is, in a way, a very modern-sounding problem. The mechanism was medieval hand-carried letters in code rather than encrypted messaging apps, but the underlying challenge of communicating dangerous ideas under institutional surveillance was entirely familiar. What Bull gave the revolt was something that pure economic grievance cannot provide, a moral framework. The specific economic complaints, the poll tax, the labour laws, the villain obligations were real and legitimate, but they were also finite. They could, in theory, be addressed by specific policy changes, which is exactly what the rebels' demand list proposed. The moral framework that Bull articulated went further than specific policies. It proposed that the current arrangement of society was wrong, not just inefficient or inconvenient, but wrong in a fundamental sense that derived from the deepest commitments of the culture's shared belief system. This is the difference between a grievance and a movement. Grievances can be settled. A movement with a coherent moral critique of the existing order is pursuing something that cannot be satisfied by a partial concession and an administrative adjustment. It is pursuing a different world. Whether all the rebels of 1381 subscribed to the full theological and political implications of Bull's argument, or whether most of them were primarily motivated by the much more immediate practical complaints about the poll tax and the labour laws, is a question that the historical evidence cannot fully resolve. Probably both were true simultaneously in different proportions for different people. What is clear is that the ideological framework Bull provided the language of God-given equality, of justice as a divine requirement rather than a political concession, of the moral illegitimacy of a system that denied fundamental human dignity, gave the revolt a coherence and a purpose that purely material grievances would not have generated on their own. It gave the marchers something to believe in, beyond just the list of demands, and that is a different kind of fuel. Bull himself, released from Maidstone prison by the rebels in the first days of June, joined the march and continued preaching throughout the London events. His presence with the rebel force was publicly known, and gave the movement an ideological authority that complemented Wat Tyler's organisational authority. The two men represented different dimensions of what the revolt was: Tyler the practical and political, Bull the moral and theological. Together they made the movement more formidable than either could have managed alone, which is why the government's subsequent priority after the events at Smithfield removed Tyler was to find Bull and deal with him separately. He was captured after the revolt collapsed, tried for his activities, and executed in July 1381. The transcript of his trial, such as it survives, suggests he was neither cowed nor particularly apologetic about his decades of preaching. He had said what he believed, and the people in power had found it dangerous enough to kill him for it, which was, in its own grim way, a testament to how seriously they took the ideas he represented. The lasting intellectual legacy of Bull's argument is harder to trace than the immediate history of the revolt, because ideas do not leave paper trails in the way that legal proceedings do. But the theological critique he articulated the use of Christian egalitarianism as an argument against social hierarchy did not die with him in 1381. It would resurface in the religious controversies of the following century, reappear in substantially developed form in the arguments of the Lollards, and eventually feed, through several generations of intellectual transmission and mutation, into the religious radicalism of the English Civil War era, when men like the Levellers and Diggers made essentially the same theological argument in considerably more systematic form. The line is long and often underground, but it is there. Bull was not an eccentric fringe figure. He was an early voice in a tradition that would take 2 more centuries to reach its fullest expression, and the fact that he is less famous than the events of 1381 is one of those historical ironies that the more reflective kind of historian tends to find quietly annoying. The Lollards, who had become the most significant organised religious dissent movement in late medieval England, drew from some of the same wells as Bull, particularly in their critique of church wealth and their insistence that religious authority needed to be grounded in scripture and moral example rather than institutional position and wealth. John Wycliffe, whose theological writings provided the intellectual scaffolding for the Lollard movement, was operating in exactly the same period as the revolt, and while the relationship between Wycliffe's academic theology and Bull's popular preaching is not a direct line of influence, they were both responding to the same visible contradictions in the institutional church's claim to moral authority while practicing economic exploitation. The authorities were not wrong to worry that theological and economic critique were feeding each other. They absolutely were, and the attempts to suppress both simultaneously through prosecution and imprisonment were, as we now know, only partially successful. There is something additionally worth noting about the specific form that Bull's argument took the compressed rhetorical question rather than the extended theological treatise. The question format was not accidental. It was pedagogically deliberate. A question engages the listener in a way that a statement does not. When Bull asked who was the gentleman when Adam delved and Eve span, he was inviting his audience to work out the answer for themselves, which meant they were not simply receiving an idea, but generating it through their own reasoning. An idea you have thought through yourself is considerably more resistant to institutional counter-argument than one you have simply been told. The Church could imprison Bull. It could not easily unask the question for the people who had heard it and worked out the answer on their own. This is the specific rhetorical genius of the formulation, and it is why the question survived him by centuries while most of what any given preacher says in any given year vanishes without trace. Now, having given Bull the theological and intellectual space he deserves, We need to talk about Wat Tyler because Tyler is in many ways the more difficult historical subject, and the difficulty is revealing. Ball is hard to recover because the records of popular preaching are sparse, and because the Church systematically suppressed the written traces of what it considered dangerous ideas. Tyler is hard to recover for a different reason. The records exist, but they were written almost entirely by people who had every incentive to misrepresent him. The chronicles of 1381 are, with essentially no exception, hostile to the revolt and hostile to its leaders. They are written by men who regarded what Tyler had done as an outrage against divine and natural order, and who were not above embellishing details in ways that would confirm their readers' sense that these were dangerous and ignoble men rather than dangerous and politically sophisticated ones. Sifting the actual Tyler from the chronicle caricature requires the same kind of careful, source-critical work that any attempt to write history from below against the grain of the surviving sources demands. What we can say with reasonable confidence about Tyler's origins and background is, frustratingly, not very much. He was Kentish either from the county itself or connected to it through work or family. He was almost certainly not a high-born man, but he was not a simple agricultural labourer either. The quality of his leadership, the ability to maintain discipline over a large and heterogeneous force, to conduct political negotiations with the king, to articulate a specific and sophisticated programme of demands, and to manage the complex internal dynamics of a movement that included people with very different immediate interests, requires a background that goes beyond the purely agricultural. The most plausible reconstruction is that he was a skilled craftsman of some kind, possibly a tiler or a soldier, possibly both at different points in his life, who had developed the organizational and rhetorical skills through practical experience managing men in circumstances that required real authority rather than inherited position. The soldier hypothesis is attractive and has been argued by several historians, on the grounds that his tactical competence, the speed and organisation of the Kentish march, the coordination with Essex, the management of the approach to London looks like someone who has experience moving large groups of men through unfamiliar territory toward a military objective. England had been sending armies to France for decades, and the men who came back from those campaigns brought with them not just military experience, but a kind of practical confidence in collective action, and an awareness of how power actually operated that was different from anything available in the purely domestic context. If Tyler had served in France, and the circumstantial evidence, while not conclusive, is suggestive, he would have seen organised military force achieve things that would have seemed impossible from the perspective of a village field. He would also have seen how leaders actually led, which is through demonstrated competence and earned credibility rather than hereditary rank, and he seems to have operated on exactly that principle. The craftsman hypothesis has its own appeal. The guild structures of medieval crafts required their senior members to organise collective action, manage disputes, negotiate with employers and municipal authorities, and maintain the discipline and reputation of the craft as an institutional entity. A master craftsman with experience in guild governance would have had exactly the organisational toolkit that Tyler's leadership required: the ability to chair a meeting, to broker compromises between competing interests, to speak with authority in front of hostile audiences, and to maintain the support of peers who could withdraw their cooperation at any point. These skills were not common in the medieval world, they were genuinely specialised, and they were found in specific social locations. Tyler had them, whatever their origin. What the chronicles agree on, despite their hostility, is that Tyler had a quality of personal presence that commanded attention and generated loyalty in ways that purely hierarchical authority does not. He is described as direct, confident, unawed by the social theatre of royal authority, the elaborate protocols of deference and formality that were the normal medium of any interaction between commoners and kings, and capable of speaking plainly to power in a way that the power in question found simultaneously impressive and infuriating. The council members and courtiers who observed his negotiations with Richard II were watching a man behave as though the difference in social status between a Kentish rebel leader and an anointed king was an interesting convention, rather than an immutable fact of nature, and this unashamed social confidence was, in the context of the time, itself a kind of revolutionary act. His demands at the Mile End meeting with the king on June 14th, the first formal negotiation between the rebel leadership and the crown, were not the improvisations of a man who had not thought things through. They were a coherent programme, and they were presented as such. Tyler presented them as demands, not as petitions. He was not begging, he was negotiating. The distinction was not subtle, and in the context of 14th century social relations between a rebel peasant leader and a king, it was striking enough that the chronicles record it despite themselves. The king, to his credit and Richard II, has a complicated reputation that the events of 1381 complicate in interesting ways, responded at Mile End with something that, at the time, looked like genuine concession. The Royal Council was terrified, understandably, of the forces assembled outside London. The King's charters granting freedom from serfdom and confirming the rebels' demands were issued at Mile End, written out and sealed with the royal seal. Many of the rebel contingents, having received what they had marched to obtain, began dispersing toward home. It looked, for a moment, like the revolt had achieved its purposes through negotiation rather than force. Tyler, characteristically, was not among those who dispersed. He was shrewd enough to understand that royal promises made under duress in the middle of a crisis were not the same thing as royal promises that had been made from a position of genuine choice, and he remained in London with the Kentish forces while the situation continued to develop. The second meeting at Smithfield on June 15th tells us something additional about Tyler's political thinking. His demands at Smithfield went further than at Mile End. He asked for the disendowment of the church, meaning the redistribution of church wealth to the general population, as well as more radical transformations of the legal and social structure. The escalation has puzzled some historians, who read it as overreach or as the hubris of a man intoxicated by his position. A more sympathetic reading sees it as a calculated pressure tactic. Having established that the king was willing to negotiate in principle, Tyler was testing how far that willingness extended and simultaneously trying to secure the maximum possible before the political moment passed. He was right to push. The moment was always going to be brief. What he could not have anticipated was quite how brief it would turn out to be. The specific dynamics of what happened at Smithfield, the confrontation, the intervention of William Walworth, the death of Tyler will be dealt with in full in the chapter on the betrayal at Smithfield, because it deserves that dedicated space. What matters here is what Tyler's death immediately revealed about the revolt, that it had been more dependent on his specific personal authority than the sophisticated organisational infrastructure might suggest. The dispersal that followed his death was not instantaneous, and the revolt continued in some regions for weeks afterward. But the loss of the movement's most effective representative at the precise moment of highest political pressure was a blow that proved ultimately decisive. The movement had built remarkable organisational capacity across a wide geography, but it had not built a mechanism for transferring the authority of its leading voice to an institutional successor in the way that established governments transfer authority through hereditary or elective succession. Tyler's death left a gap that no one could quite fill. Part of this was simply the nature of his specific leadership authority, earned through demonstrated personal competence, is not easily transferred to someone else the way a title can be passed on. When a hereditary monarch died, there was always an heir whose claim was legally established in advance. When a leader like Tyler died, there was no formal mechanism for determining who came next, and the organisational coherence of the movement depended too heavily on his personal credibility to survive without him in its initial form. This is not a criticism unique to Tyler or to the rebels of 1381. It is a structural challenge that most popular movements built on personal, rather than institutional authority have faced throughout history, and the rebels of 1381 had neither the time nor the political conditions to solve it. The management of the rebel forces in London over the days between their arrival and Smithfield was itself a remarkable feat that Tyler's reputation tends to obscure rather than illuminate, because the dramatic end story overwrites the more mundane but equally important story of what happened before it. Maintaining a force of tens of thousands of people in a major city, with all the temptations of urban wealth and the inevitable frictions between different groups with different immediate interests, while simultaneously conducting political negotiations with the Crown and managing the symbolic politics of occupying the capital without triggering a military crackdown, this was an extraordinary organisational challenge. The fact that it was managed as well as it was, for as long as it was, is a measure of Tyler's capabilities that the dramatic finale tends to overshadow. The comparison between Ball and Tyler as complementary leaders of the same movement is worth holding on to, because it illuminates something about how successful popular movements actually work. Tyler provided what might be called operational authority the demonstrated competence in organising, leading, and negotiating that generated practical loyalty. Bull provided ideological authority, the moral and theological framework that gave the movement a claim to legitimacy that went beyond the specific grievances driving it. Effective popular movements generally need both, and the failure to develop either of them into institutionally durable forms was one of the reasons the revolt, for all its remarkable achievements, did not produce the permanent structural changes it sought. They had the fire and the ideas. What they did not have, and what was probably impossible to build in the few weeks of the revolt's existence, was the institutional framework that could carry those ideas forward after the fire was suppressed. There is a question that the history of Ball and Tyler together raises, and that deserves an honest answer. Was there a realistic path from where they were in June 1381 to the world they were asking for? The honest answer is probably not in the short term, not through the specific mechanism of the revolt as it actually unfolded. The forces aligned against them were formidable in ways that went beyond the purely military. Even if Smithfield had gone differently, even if Tyler had survived and the negotiations had continued, the king's concessions would almost certainly have been walked back by a royal council that had no intention of allowing them to stand. The structural power of the English aristocracy and the institutional church was too deeply embedded in the legal, economic and military fabric of the kingdom to be overturned by a summer's revolt, however brilliantly organised. The rebels of 1381 were, in this sense, attempting something that the conditions of the time did not quite permit, but that does not make what they attempted trivial or their ideas wrong. It makes it tragic in the specific classical sense, the endeavour of people who were right about what needed to change, but whose moment had not yet fully arrived. London in June 1381 was a city of roughly 40 to 50,000 people, which made it by far the largest urban settlement in England, and a place of a complexity and density that most of the rebels arriving from Essex and Kent had never encountered before. Medieval London was not a planned city in any meaningful sense. It had grown organically over centuries, layering Roman walls, Saxon street patterns, Norman institutions, and the accumulated architectural ambitions of successive merchant dynasties into something that was simultaneously magnificent and chaotic, a compressed geography of extreme wealth and extreme poverty, sharing streets, sharing water sources, and sharing the particular social tensions that come from radical inequality, arranged at very close quarters. The rebels who entered on the night of June 12th and the morning of June 13th were walking into an environment that was simultaneously the seat of the power they were challenging, and a community of people whose own relationship with that power was considerably more complicated than the neat them versus us framing of the revolt might suggest. London's internal social structure was itself a kind of microcosm of the inequalities that had driven the revolt in the countryside, just arranged in urban rather than agricultural terms. At the top sat the great merchant families, the wool exporters, the cloth merchants, the goldsmiths who dominated the major guilds and through them the city's government. Below them were the middling craftsmen and traders of the lesser guilds, people who had genuine economic independence but limited political voice. Below them were the journeymen and apprentices who formed the majority of the skilled workforce, bound to their masters in relationships that had some structural echoes of the lord-peasant dynamic, and who had their own grievances about guild restrictions on wages, conditions of work and access to the full rights of their crafts. Below all of these were the casual labourers, the servants, the dock workers, and the truly poor who inhabited the outer margins of the city's formal economic life with minimal legal protection and maximum vulnerability to every economic fluctuation. When the rebels arrived in London, they were not arriving in hostile territory. They were arriving in a city where a substantial portion of the population had their own reasons for dissatisfaction with the existing order, and where the merchant elite that controlled the city government was not popular among those it governed. The city's aldermanic government was, in 1381, particularly unpopular for specific local reasons beyond the general grievances about the poll tax and the war. The commercial policies of the dominant merchant families had generated resentment among smaller traders and craftsmen, who found themselves disadvantaged by guild regulations that favoured established interests. The concentration of major trade privileges in the hands of a relatively small number of wealthy families had been a source of political conflict within the city for years. The revolt arriving from outside intersected with tensions that were already present inside, and the result was a city that was significantly less unified in its response to the rebels than its government would have preferred. The entry itself remains one of the more contested moments in the historical record, for reasons discussed in the previous chapter. What is clear is that by the morning of June 13th, large forces of rebels from both Kent and Essex were inside the city walls, and the authorities had not managed to prevent it. The London aldermen who were nominally responsible for the city's defence found themselves in the unenviable position of managing a city that was not going to reliably follow their orders in any direction, caught between the rebels outside and a citizenry whose loyalties were, to put it diplomatically, mixed. The mayor, William Walworth, who would play a rather more decisive role in subsequent events, was doing what mayors in crisis situations generally do, which is frantically trying to manage a situation that is evolving considerably faster than any plan can accommodate. The rebels' behaviour in the first hours inside the city is worth examining carefully, because it is here that the gap between the chronicle accounts and the actual evidence is widest. The chronicles, written in the aftermath by men who were genuinely terrified by what had happened, emphasised chaos, violence, and destruction as undifferentiated phenomena. The actual record of what was targeted and what was not targeted tells a considerably more selective story. The rebels moved through the city with what, given the circumstances, was a remarkable degree of purposefulness. They knew where they were going. They had presumably been briefed, or had information from London contacts about the geography of their targets. And the targets they chose were not random. The Savoy Palace stands first and most conspicuously in any account of the London events, and rightly so. It was, in 1381, one of the grandest private residences in England, built and furnished at enormous expense by John of Gaunt, as a statement of his wealth and power that was difficult to misread. The palace sat on the north bank of the Thames between the city and Westminster, and it contained, according to contemporary accounts, treasures accumulated over decades of the kind of ostentatious wealth display that the great lords of 14th century England practised with considerable enthusiasm. Tapestries, silverware, jewels, furniture, the accumulated portable wealth of one of the richest men in the kingdom, all of it was there, in a building that represented to the marching rebels everything they had come to London to challenge. What the rebels did at the Savoy, and equally importantly what they did not do, is one of the most revealing episodes of the entire revolt. They burned it. Systematically and thoroughly, they set the palace alight and ensured that it burned down to its foundations, rendering one of the finest buildings in England a ruin that was never rebuilt. This took deliberate, organised effort. A building that large does not burn completely without sustained attention, and the rebels applied that attention. But here is the detail that the chroniclers cannot quite suppress despite their general commitment to portraying the rebels as a looting mob. They did not steal from it. The people who went through the Savoy before and during the burning were under explicit orders enforced, apparently, with real internal discipline that nothing was to be taken. Anything found inside was to be destroyed, not pocketed. At least one man who was caught trying to walk away with a piece of silver plate was reportedly thrown into the fire along with the plate, which was either a powerful statement of principle or a very severe approach to property crime, depending on your perspective. The reasoning behind this discipline was politically significant. If the rebels had looted the Savoy, they would have been thieves, and they knew it, and they knew how that would be characterised by their enemies. They were not there to enrich themselves at John of Gaunt's expense. They were there to erase the symbol. The destruction of the Savoy was a political statement, not a robbery. It was the physical equivalent of what burning manorial court rolls meant in the countryside, the elimination of a specific instrument and symbol of a specific kind of power. John of Gaunt was not present. He was in the north at the time, which was fortunate for him, and perhaps mildly disappointing for the rebels, who had made such a long journey in part with him in mind. The palace would have to do. The internal discipline required to burn a palace full of treasures without pocketing any of it deserves a pause, because it is genuinely remarkable as a demonstration of collective self-governance. Consider the practical challenge. You have thousands of people who have marched for days, who are angry, who are tired, who have been materially deprived for their entire lives, and you're asking them to walk through a building full of silver plate and fine tapestries and leave it all behind to burn. Modern event security does not always manage this level of discipline with professional staff and explicit enforcement mechanisms. The rebels managed it through peer accountability and shared political commitment. When the man who pocketed the silver was thrown into the fire, it was not a calculated act of exemplary punishment. By an authority figure, it was the community enforcing its own stated rules, which is a considerably more demanding form of discipline. The fact that it worked, that the Savoy burned and was not looted, is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the rebel force was operating with a genuine collective political consciousness, rather than the opportunistic chaos the chronicles would have us believe. The fires at the Savoy were visible across much of London, and their symbolic impact was significant. This was not a slum burning or a market fire or any of the accidental urban blazes that were a regular feature of medieval city life. This was the most conspicuous private palace in the capital, and it was burning because people who had been told their entire lives that they counted for nothing had decided to make a rather emphatic counter-argument. The royal family, sheltered in the Tower of London watching the smoke rise, would have had no difficulty understanding the message. Whether they drew the intended conclusion from it was a different matter, and the answer to that question would unfold over the following days. The Tower of London itself deserves attention, because it was simultaneously the symbol of ultimate royal authority and the place where the royal family was effectively trapped during the revolt's London phase. Richard II, 14 years old, his mother, Joan of Kent, and the senior members of the Royal Council had retreated to the Tower when the rebels' approach became clear, and they remained there through the first days of the London events, watching from its walls as their city went through its crisis. The Tower was theoretically impregnable. It had been designed and built as a place of last resort, the ultimate fortified position from which royal authority could be defended against any threat. In practice, the Crown was discovering that a fortress keeps you safe from attack, but is less useful as a base from which to conduct political negotiations with tens of thousands of people occupying your capital. Being safe inside your fortress while your city burns outside it is its own kind of problem. The king's decision to come out of the Tower and meet the rebels in person was, in the context, an act of either considerable personal courage or considerable political calculation, or quite possibly both simultaneously. Richard II has never quite received the historical credit for his behaviour in June 1381 that his actual conduct deserves, probably because his later reign was troubled enough that subsequent generations tended to read backward from his eventual deposition and see weakness where there was actually considerable presence. A 14-year-old riding out to face tens of thousands of angry armed men on an open field is not, whatever else you want to say about it, cowardice. It is the kind of thing that looks different depending entirely on whether it works. The first meeting at Mile End on June 14th, where the king rode out with a small escort to meet the rebel leadership, had the quality of a genuinely improvised encounter. The Royal Council had spent the preceding days in the Tower arguing about what to do, and the quality of their deliberations can perhaps be measured by the fact that their best available option was to send a teenager on horseback to negotiate in person with the people who had just burned down the grandest palace in England. The plan, such as it was to offer enough concessions to induce the rebels to disperse, then manage the aftermath from a position of restored stability. Whether the concessions offered were intended as genuine commitments or as temporary measures to diffuse the immediate crisis is a question that events would answer quite clearly, but that is for a later chapter. The rebels' behaviour at Mile End orderly, focused, articulating specific demands through their leadership as described in the previous chapter, confirmed for the royal party what the march itself had already suggested. These were not people who would be satisfied with vague reassurances or promises to look into their concerns. They wanted specific things in writing, with the royal seal attached, and they were going to wait until they had them. The charters that Richard granted at Mile End confirming the abolition of serfdom, and the other demands were written out and distributed to different regional contingents of the rebel force, and a significant portion of those contingents took the charters and departed for home, satisfied that they had achieved what they came for. This dispersal is sometimes presented as naive, the rebels going home on the basis of promises that would be broken, but it reflects a genuine and not unreasonable calculation. If the king in writing, under his own seal, had promised these things, the legal weight of those charters was not nothing. Challenging a royal charter in the manorial courts of England was a real option, and the people who went home with them were not simply being fooled. They were making a bet on whether the Crown would honour its word. As bets go, it turned out to be a losing one, but the reasoning behind it was not irrational. While the Mile End negotiations were proceeding, events elsewhere in the city were developing in ways that the royal party's focus on the main negotiation was not fully tracking. Different groups within the rebel coalition had their own specific agendas, and not all of them were simply waiting for the political negotiations to conclude. The targeting of the lawyers at the Inns of Court, the legal professionals and their records was already underway, reflecting the specific grievance about the legal apparatus that had been central to the movement's program from the beginning. Several of the lawyers most prominently associated with the enforcement of labour laws and the legal defence of manorial privilege found themselves in a position that their legal training had not specifically prepared them for. The concept that legal records were a form of violence against the poor, and that their destruction was therefore a legitimate act of justice rather than mere vandalism, was not a perspective the legal profession shared, but it was one that the rebels had articulated clearly and were acting on with considerable consistency. The prisons were opened. This sounds like a minor logistical detail in the context of the larger events, but it was symbolically significant and practically consequential. Medieval prisons were not the institutionally neutral detention facilities of modern imagination. They were instruments of a specific kind of social control, and a disproportionate number of their inhabitants at any given time were people whose imprisonment connected directly to the economic grievances driving the revolt, men jailed for debt, for labour law violations, for inability to pay fines imposed by manorial courts. Opening the prisons was not a general act of lawlessness. It was a specific act of liberation aimed at a specific set of people imprisoned for specific reasons that the rebels considered unjust. The freed prisoners joined the rebel forces or dispersed into the city. In either case, the symbolic message was the same as burning the court records. The machinery of legal oppression was being taken apart piece by piece. The attacks on the Flemish merchants and craftsmen in the city require the most careful treatment, because they represent the dimension of the London events most uncomfortable to look at directly. Flemish workers in London were not lords, not tax collectors, not lawyers, not representatives of the institutional apparatus of oppression. They were skilled craftsmen and small traders who had come to England to work, and several dozen of them were killed during the London events in circumstances that the chronicles record and that modern accounts generally note with varying degrees of explicitness. Understanding what happened requires holding two things simultaneously: the economic logic of the resentment, already described in Chapter 3, and the moral reality that economic resentment does not constitute justification for violence against civilian workers. Let us return with some relief to a more admirable dimension of the London events, the extraordinary phenomenon of individuals using the chaos of the rebellion to press specific personal claims that would have been inaccessible to them through normal channels. Among the more remarkable of these cases was a woman named Marjorie Tor, or a woman like her, since the historical record here is fragmentary enough that the specific name carries a caveat. But the type of case is well documented who made her way through the burning streets of London with a specific legal grievance about property rights that she intended to present to the king in person. The revolt had, among other things, removed the normal gatekeeping apparatus that kept ordinary people from accessing royal justice directly. The king was accessible in a way he would not normally have been, and people with long-standing grievances that the manorial court system had failed to address recognized the opportunity and seized it. This phenomenon, individuals presenting their personal petitions to the king during the revolt, is something that the standard dramatic narrative of the London events tends to skip over in favour of the more cinematically legible scenes of fire and negotiation. But it is historically important precisely because it illustrates what the revolt meant to ordinary people, beyond the specific programme of demands that Tyler was presenting at the formal negotiations. For Marjorie Tor and people like her, the 6 days in June 1381 represented a brief opening in the normal social wall between those who had access to royal justice and those who did not. The chaos that the ruling class experienced as a crisis was, for some of the people living at the bottom of the social hierarchy, a rare window of access to the mechanisms of power that were supposed to serve them, but normally did not. The phenomenon of individual petitioning during the revolt also illuminates something about gender that the standard account tends to obscure entirely. The legal system of 14th century England was, in formal terms, deeply inhospitable to women's independent legal action. Married women, in particular, had extremely limited legal standing to sue or appear in court in their own name, since the doctrine of coverture, the legal fiction that a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's meant that most legal claims had to be made through a male representative. Widows had somewhat more legal independence, which is why widows appeared disproportionately in the records of medieval women's legal activity, but even they faced significant structural obstacles. The revolt, by temporarily disrupting the normal gatekeeping apparatus and creating direct access to the king outside the normal legal channels, opened a space that women like Marjorie Tor were willing and able to use precisely because it bypassed the normal system that excluded them. The revolt's disruptive effect on normal legal procedure was, paradoxically, a brief expansion of access for people who were normally shut out of that procedure entirely. This is a nuance that the dramatic account of burning and marching almost entirely obscures, but it is historically significant. The revolt created space for voices that the normal system was specifically designed not to hear. The petitions presented during this period varied widely in their specific content. Some concerned property disputes that had been running for years through lower courts without satisfactory resolution. Some involved claims against specific lords or officials for abuses of their authority. Some were more personal disputes over inheritance, questions about legal status, claims that had been repeatedly dismissed by courts whose operators had no incentive to rule against the powerful parties involved. What they shared was the quality of suddenly arriving in front of the person who had the actual authority to resolve them, rather than the series of intermediate officials who had been absorbing and deflecting them for years. Whether the king actually heard and acted on these individual petitions in the chaos of the London events is a question the records cannot fully answer, but the fact that people made the attempt is itself remarkable, and speaks to both the desperation and the agency of those who did. The image of ordinary people, women among them, which was itself legally and socially extraordinary, navigating smoke-filled streets to hand a petition to a king who was simultaneously managing a political crisis of national proportions, is one of those historical details that does not fit easily into any pre-existing narrative. It is not the story of heroic rebels confronting power. It is not the story of helpless victims of historical forces. It is the story of people who saw an opening and took it, which is perhaps the most human story there is. The geography of rebel activity during the 6 London days was not uniform across the city. Different parts of London experienced the revolt differently, and the experience was shaped by the internal social geography of the city as much as by the rebels' programme. The wealthy merchant areas of the city, particularly those associated with the Italians and Flemings, who dominated certain trades, were targets. The Inns of Court were targets. The administrative offices of the royal government were targets. The properties of specific individuals on specific lists were targets. But large portions of the city, the streets and neighbourhoods of the ordinary London working population, experienced the revolt largely as spectators, watching from doorways and windows as forces moved through toward their identified destinations, neither harmed nor actively engaged, unless they happened to be standing between the rebels and something the rebels had come to address. The administrative heart of English government, the offices clustered around Westminster, that managed the records of royal justice, taxation, and parliamentary proceedings, received particular attention. The Chancery, where legal writs were issued and royal records maintained, was a primary target, and the destruction of records there was on a scale that created genuine administrative problems for the government in the months following the revolt. Some of the destroyed records were, from a purely practical perspective, never fully reconstructed, which meant that specific legal claims, including some of the claims that lords wanted to use to reverse the Mile End concessions, lacked the documentary basis they would normally have required. The rebels' record destruction strategy had, in other words, a legacy that outlasted the revolt itself, in the specific and unglamorous form of archival gaps that complicated the restoration of the pre-revolt legal order. The treatment of the Archbishop of Canterbury is one of the more discussed incidents of the London events, both because of the specific identity of the man involved, and because it illustrates the movement's particular relationship with the institutional church. Simon Sudbury, who combined the roles of Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England, which tells you something about the blurring of ecclesiastical and governmental functions in 14th century administration, had been a visible target from early in the revolt's development. As Chancellor, he was associated with the administration of the poll tax and the government's financial management of the war. As Archbishop, he was associated with the institutional church's economic behaviour and its specific suppression of popular preaching, including the repeated imprisonment of John Ball. He was, in the rebels' accounting, doubly implicated, both as a governmental figure responsible for the tax and as an ecclesiastical figure responsible for the suppression of the theological arguments that justified their cause. Sudbury had taken refuge in the Tower with the rest of the royal party. When the Tower itself was accessed, the circumstances of how the rebels got inside vary in different accounts, but access they did. In one of the more surprising logistical developments of an already surprising few days, Sudbury was among those found there. His death was the most prominent among several killings that took place in this episode, and the chronicles, many of them written by people who were personally connected to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, record it with predictable horror. Sudbury had apparently been in prayer when found, which added a specifically religious dimension to the accounts of his death. The rebels' treatment of the archbishop was not the random killing of an innocent, but the specific targeting of a man they identified as responsible for specific wrongs, and the political weight of making the Archbishop of Canterbury the revolt's most prominent victim was not something the rebel leadership had been unaware of. It was a statement, as much as the burning of the Savoy had been a statement, about which institutions and which individuals the movement held responsible for the conditions it was fighting against. The Royal Council members who survived the Tower episode were not unaware that the situation had escalated considerably beyond what the Mile End negotiations were meant to manage. The concessions offered at Mile End, the Charters of Freedom, the abolition of serfdom had induced a significant portion of the rebel force to go home, but a substantial contingent remained, still in London, still presenting demands, and now operating in a city where the government's control was visibly attenuated, and its senior officials were either dead or barricaded in the Tower. The decision to arrange the second meeting at Smithfield on June 15th was made against this background, and the people who arranged it had, it appears, already decided that the negotiation strategy had reached its limits, and that a different approach was required. What that approach would be, and how it would be implemented in the specific physical and political circumstances of a Smithfield meeting, was something they had apparently planned with more care than the dramatic account usually emphasises. The 6 days in London were not, it must be said, a unified or cleanly organised series of events with a coherent internal logic. They were a simultaneous, multi-threaded crisis involving tens of thousands of people with partly overlapping and partly divergent interests, operating in an unfamiliar city under conditions of extreme pressure, producing outcomes that none of the parties involved had fully anticipated or planned for. The burning of the Savoy and the targeted destruction of legal records and the individual petitioners making their way to the King and the Flemish deaths, and the opening of the prisons and the Tower episode were all happening in overlapping and interacting ways that no single narrative can fully capture. The 6 days were, in a sense, a compressed version of everything the revolt had been building toward the specific grievances, the political programme, the organisational capacity, the internal contradictions and the limits of what popular movement could achieve within the specific constraints of its historical moment. What came next at Smithfield was the moment that resolved the London crisis, though not in the direction the rebels had been working toward. And understanding it properly requires one additional piece of context: the precise relationship between the King's visible courage and the Mayor's hidden dagger, and the question of how much of what happened at Smithfield was improvised in the moment and how much was calculated in advance. That question does not have a clean answer, which is part of what makes it so compelling, and it is the subject of the next chapter. Smithfield on the morning of June 15th, 1381 was a large open space just outside the city walls to the northwest, a livestock market in normal times, which gave it a certain ironic quality, as the stage for events that would be discussed for centuries. It was the kind of place where practical transactions happened. Animals were bought and sold, prices were negotiated, and people who knew what things were worth made their assessments and came to terms. On June 15th, the transaction that took place there was of a rather different character, and the assessment of what things were worth turned out to be rather more final than a livestock deal. The arrangement of the meeting itself tells you something about the state of affairs at that point. The royal party had spent 2 days watching their city operate under conditions that no one in the council had any experience managing. The Mile End concessions had dispersed a significant portion of the rebel force, as intended, but a substantial contingent remained the Kentish forces under Tyler, the most politically sophisticated and the most determined segment of the movement, the group that had not been satisfied by the charters issued at Mile End and had remained in London pressing for more. The council was, by all accounts, exhausted, frightened, and increasingly determined that the situation needed to end by some means other than continued concession. The specific means settled on was the second personal meeting at Smithfield, and while the chronicles disagree on exactly how much of what happened there was pre-planned versus improvised under pressure, the weight of evidence suggests that at least some of the royal party had decided in advance that this meeting was not intended to be another round of negotiations. Richard too rode out to Smithfield with a small escort, the same kind of almost theatrical personal exposure to risk that he had demonstrated at Mile End, and which was becoming something of a signature. Whether his advisers had told him exactly what they intended to happen, and obtained his consent, or whether the 14-year-old king was partly improvising in response to events as they developed, is a question the sources cannot definitively answer. What we know is that he rode out, that Tyler came forward to meet him, and that the encounter between them was, by all accounts, initially civil. Tyler presented his demands the Smithfield programme that went further than Mile End, including the disendowment of the church and more radical transformations of the social structure, and the king, by several accounts, responded with apparent willingness to discuss them. The exchange had the surface quality of a genuine negotiation. Then, within a short span of time that different accounts compress or expand according to their purposes, the situation changed. The specific trigger for the violence that followed is described differently in different sources. Tyler was accused of making some gesture or statement that was interpreted as threatening or disrespectful. There was a confrontation with a member of the royal party. Tyler drew a knife. The details differ. What is consistent across the sources is the outcome. William Walworth, the Mayor of London, struck Tyler. Tyler was pulled from his horse. He was wounded, and though he initially managed to keep himself upright by sheer will, one account describes him making it some distance toward his own lines. Before collapsing, he was dying. A member of the royal escort finished the job. The moment Tyler fell, the situation became simultaneously extremely dangerous and extraordinarily revealing. The rebel force, watching their leader go down in front of them at what was supposed to be a peaceful negotiation, had every reason to respond with immediate and overwhelming force. They had the numbers, they had the position, they had at that moment the most straightforward possible moral justification for whatever they chose to do next. The royal party, by contrast, had a small escort and a teenager on a horse, no castle walls within immediate reach, and the realistic prospect that if the rebel force charged, the political crisis of the past week was going to end in a way that the chronicle accounts would have had considerable difficulty explaining to posterity. What happened instead is the moment that Richard II undeniably earned his historical moment. He rode forward, not away from the rebel force toward them. He rode toward tens of thousands of angry armed men whose leader had just been cut down at what was supposed to be a royal negotiation, and he called out something to the effect that he was their king and their captain, and that they should follow him. The precise words are reported differently across the sources, but the action is consistent. A young king, in a moment of extreme personal danger, rode toward the danger rather than away from it. Whether this was genuine courage, a calculated bet on the rebels' continuing loyalty to the crown as an institution, or simply the action of someone who had not quite worked through all the implications of the situation, it worked. The rebel force hesitated. Some accounts say they went to their knees. The immediate crisis of the moment after Tyler's death was contained. The subsequent hours revealed the calculated dimension behind what had looked like a spontaneous crisis. The Mayor of London, instead of facing consequences for what might have appeared to be an assassination of the rebel leader during a negotiation, was knighted rewarded essentially within hours of the event. This is not what happens when a panicked official makes a terrible misjudgment. This is what happens when someone who has done exactly what was needed gets his bonus. The speed and decisiveness of Walworth's reward, combined with the equally rapid arrival of the military force that had been assembled in the city during the negotiations, suggests strongly that the Smithfield meeting had been designed not as a continuation of the negotiation process, but as the place where the negotiation process would end by one means or another. The arrival of the military force men-at-arms who had been gathering in London under various noble commands during the preceding days while the negotiations occupied the rebels' attention transformed the situation at Smithfield from a crisis into a demonstration of restored order. The rebel force, suddenly confronted with an armed royalist contingent in addition to the death of their leader, dispersed. There was no pitched battle. The numbers made one-sided engagement a certainty, and the rebels' organisational coherence, already shaken by Tyler's death, was insufficient to sustain coordinated resistance in the immediate aftermath. The young king rode at the head of the force back into a city that had spent 6 days in various states of controlled chaos, and the military and political situation was, on the surface, restored. The speed of the military response is itself evidence of prior planning. Building up a significant armed force in London over the preceding days required coordination, supply, and the kind of quiet organisational activity that does not happen spontaneously in response to a developing crisis. The noble retinues that appeared at Smithfield had been assembling for reasons they had been given instructions, gathered their men, moved into position. All of this happened while the rebel leadership's attention was focused on the negotiations at Mile End and the management of the London events. The Royal Council had, in other words, been running 2 parallel processes simultaneously: a visible negotiation intended to manage and delay, and a concealed military mobilisation intended to create the conditions for ending the crisis by force at the right moment. Smithfield was the right moment, and the right moment had been prepared. The apparently improvised crisis of Tyler's death was the trigger that activated a plan whose outlines had been taking shape for days. None of this diminishes Richard's personal performance at Smithfield. Whatever the planning that surrounded the meeting, the moment when the rebel force could have charged and did not charge was the moment when Richard rode toward them rather than away, and that moment was real regardless of what preceded it. A 14-year-old who can hold his nerve in that specific situation, in those specific circumstances, has something that no amount of strategic planning can manufacture. The subsequent career of Richard II, the increasing authoritarianism, the paranoia, the eventual deposition by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, sometimes makes historians reluctant to give him credit for the Smithfield performance. But credit should be given where it is due, even when the person in question later becomes complicated. Richard at Smithfield was brave. What came afterward does not change what happened in that field. What happened in the days and weeks after Smithfield is, in some ways, the most important and least celebrated part of the story, because it is where the actual character of the Crown's intentions became unambiguous. The charters issued at Mile End, the documents granting freedom from serfdom, the abolition of the labour laws, the protections that the rebels had marched to London to obtain were revoked. Not immediately in the dramatic sense of a public announcement, but through a systematic process of legal invalidation that moved with considerable efficiency through the late summer and autumn of 1381. The argument employed was elegant in its cynicism. The charters had been granted under duress, and grants made under duress had no legal validity. Technically, this was correct within the framework of medieval law. A contract signed with a knife at your throat is not a binding agreement, and the presence of tens of thousands of armed rebels outside your negotiating position could plausibly be characterized as constituting a form of duress. The fact that characterizing it this way required the Crown to admit that its own charters of freedom were documents it had issued while frightened, rather than instruments of genuine royal will, was, one assumes, a concession the Council found manageable. Richard's specific statement on the matter, the formulation that serfs were serfs and would remain serfs, and that the king had no intention of changing this through any concession extracted by force, was delivered in response to a petition from the remaining rebels of Essex who came to him seeking confirmation that the charters would be honoured. The petition itself is a remarkable document. Not because of its political naivety, the petitioners were still operating on the assumption that the king's word, once given under his seal, had some binding quality, but because of the clarity with which it articulates the rebels' understanding of what they had been promised and what they were owed. The reply they received demonstrated equally clearly that the Crown's understanding of the matter had moved on considerably since Smithfield. The petition was refused. The petitioners were sent home with the explicit message that their revolt had achieved nothing that would be allowed to stand. The suppression of the revolt in the provinces continued through the summer. In Essex, Kent, Suffolk, Norfolk, and the other counties where the uprising had spread, royal commissioners arrived to identify participants, prosecute ringleaders, and make examples sufficient to deter future action. The scale of the prosecutorial response was, by medieval standards, substantial but notably not genocidal. The Crown appears to have made a reasonably deliberate decision to pursue the leaders and visible participants with real severity, while not attempting a comprehensive punishment of entire communities, which would have been both administratively impossible and economically counterproductive. The same lords whose estates had been disrupted still needed workers, and a wholesale campaign of imprisonment and execution of agricultural labour was not a solution that served anyone's immediate practical interests, however satisfying it might have been to the more vindictive members of the council. John Ball, as noted in an earlier chapter, was captured, tried and executed in July 1381. The trial record suggests a man who had made his peace with the likely outcome, and who used whatever platform the proceedings offered him to restate his convictions rather than recant them, which was exactly the kind of defiant dignity that the Church found simultaneously impressive and extremely unhelpful. He had said what he believed, the powers that be had found it threatening enough to kill him for it, and the theological argument he had spent 20 years making was now a matter of permanent historical record, precisely because his enemies had considered it dangerous enough to formally preserve and refute. There is a gentle irony in the fact that we know John Ball's arguments as well as we do, primarily because the people who hated those arguments wrote them down carefully before executing him. The other rebel leaders met similar ends through the autumn of 1381 in the legal proceedings that followed the revolt's military suppression. The regional leaders who had emerged in Suffolk, Norfolk, Cambridge, and the other affected counties were identified, prosecuted, and in most cases executed. The formal process was important to the Crown. These were not extrajudicial killings in the heat of battle, but legal proceedings, however summary, that gave the suppression the form of law, and thereby reinforced the message that the revolt had been criminal rather than legitimate. Law had always been one of the primary instruments of the system the rebels were challenging, and using it to process the revolt's aftermath was both practically efficient and symbolically appropriate from the Crown's perspective. The question of whether Richard II personally felt any ambiguity about the way the Smithfield situation had been resolved, about the revocation of the Mile End Charters, about the subsequent prosecutions, is one that the historical record cannot answer with certainty. The later Richard, the increasingly authoritarian and eventually deposed king of the 1390s, is a complicated figure whose relationship to the events of his early reign is not entirely clear. What we can say is that the events of 1381 left marks on everyone who lived through them. For the ruling class, Smithfield confirmed that popular revolt could be managed through a combination of limited concession, personal royal charisma, and well-timed violence, a playbook that has been used with variations in different forms in different places ever since. For the Commons of England, Smithfield confirmed what they had already suspected, that the Crown's word was worth approximately what the king could be made to honour by force, and that the force necessary to honour it permanently was not available to them in 1381. Both lessons were taken seriously and shaped the subsequent course of English politics in ways that are still visible to anyone paying attention. The immediate physical legacy of the revolt in London itself was the ruined Savoy, which sat as a dramatic gap in the riverbank skyline for years. John of Gaunt, when he eventually returned to London after the crisis had passed, found his palace a ruin that was never rebuilt, partly because of the practical cost of reconstruction, partly because the political optics of rebuilding the most prominent symbol of aristocratic excess immediately after a revolt against aristocratic excess were perhaps not ideal, even by the relatively thick-skinned standards of medieval political calculation. The site eventually became a hospital, which is the kind of architectural punchline to a political story that history occasionally delivers. Now let us step back from the specific drama of June and July 1381 and look at what actually happened in the decades and centuries that followed, because the standard version of the revolt's legacy that it failed, that the rebels were killed, that the charters were revoked, and that nothing changed is both technically accurate and substantially misleading. The immediate outcome was, unambiguously, a defeat for the rebels. The specific legal changes they had demanded were not implemented. The leaders were executed. The serfs remained, in formal legal terms, serfs. If you are measuring success by the achievement of specific goals within the specific historical moment of the revolt, the verdict is clear. But history is not obliged to measure on the shortest timescale, and the longer view produces a rather different assessment. The legal institution of serfdom in England, villain tenure, The manorial obligations, the whole apparatus of bound labour that the rebels had marched to London to dismantle, did not survive the 14th century in any robust form. Not because the Crown abolished it in the aftermath of the revolt, it explicitly did not, but because the economic and demographic forces that had made labour scarce and labour bargaining possible continued to operate after 1381 just as they had before it. The Statute of Labourers continued to be theoretically in force. It continued to be enforced with varying degrees of enthusiasm by local justices, and the wages of agricultural labourers continued decade by decade to rise anyway. The gap between legal suppression and economic reality continued to widen, until the legal apparatus became simply too expensive to maintain against the weight of what was actually happening on the ground. By the middle of the 15th century, the formal institution of villein tenure had effectively ceased to exist in most of England. Not through a single dramatic act of emancipation, but through the quiet accumulation of individual manumissions, of lords accepting commuted money payments instead of labour services because labour services were becoming practically impossible to enforce, of courts declining to process villein status claims because the administrative cost outweighed the economic benefit. The process was undramatic, uncelebrated, and almost invisible in the contemporary record precisely because it happened through thousands of individual transactions rather than a single visible moment of change. There was no English equivalent of the Emancipation Proclamation, no formal declaration that serfdom was over. It simply faded out, the way bad institutional arrangements sometimes do when the economic foundation that sustained them shifts enough to make maintaining them more trouble than it is worth. The direction of travel was set by 1381, and the direction was unmistakably away from the system the rebels had challenged. The lords who participated in this quiet dismantling of serfdom were not doing so out of a change of heart about the moral arguments John Ball had been making. They were doing it because the cost-benefit analysis had shifted. Maintaining hardline enforcement of villein tenure against a workforce that had demonstrated in 1381 its capacity for organised resistance that was economically more mobile than the pre-plague population had been, and that had access to a labour market that was gradually but persistently offering better terms than villeinage could match, this was simply becoming bad management. The pragmatic decision to commute labour services for money rents, to grant manumissions to particularly valued workers, or in exchange for substantial payments, to allow the whole creaking apparatus of villein obligation to atrophy rather than fight every individual case through increasingly expensive manorial court proceedings. This was the ruling class doing the economic math rather than the moral math. The moral math had been done by Ball decades earlier. The economic math eventually arrived at the same destination, which is one of those patterns that history repeats with enough regularity to suggest it might be structural. This outcome is sometimes used to argue that the revolt was unnecessary, that the economic forces would have produced the same result eventually anyway. This argument is both technically interesting and historically shallow. The question is not whether the same endpoint would have been reached without the revolt, but how long it would have taken and what the experience of the intervening period would have been. The immediate post-revolt period saw a notable acceleration of the informal process of commutation and manumission. Lords who had just watched a significant portion of England's working population march on London made the reasonable calculation that hardline enforcement of villein obligations against workers who had just demonstrated their organisational capacity was not a comfortable long-term strategy. The revolt did not create the economic forces working against serfdom. It demonstrated that those forces had developed a political consciousness, and the demonstration had real consequences for the speed at which those economic forces were allowed to work. Every year of additional serfdom was a year of real human lives constrained by obligations that should have ended sooner. The revolt shortened that period, even if it could not end it immediately. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The intellectual legacy of the revolt is longer and harder to trace, but in some ways more interesting. John Ball's theological argument that divine equality undermined the legitimacy of human hierarchy entered the tradition of English popular religious dissent as a permanent presence. The Lollard movement, which grew rapidly in the 2 decades after the revolt, drew on some of the same wells of lay religious thought and popular theological literacy that Ball had both reflected and shaped. The arguments about church wealth, clerical corruption, and the gap between the church's spiritual claims and its material behaviour that Ball had been putting in front of popular audiences for 20 years found more systematic expression in Lollard theology, and eventually in the broader currents of late medieval religious criticism that would feed into the Reformation of the following century. The more direct political tradition runs through the religious and political upheavals of the 17th century, when the English Civil War produced a generation of radical thinkers who had absorbed and developed the medieval heritage of popular religious and political argument in ways that would have been recognisable to Ball, if rather surprising in their institutional form. The Levellers, who argued for popular sovereignty and the equal legal standing of all Englishmen, were drawing on a tradition that included Ball's argument. The Diggers, who made a more explicitly economic argument about the right of the poor to the land that their labour had made productive, were articulating in more developed form precisely the logic that the rebels of 1381 had acted on. The 17th century radicals knew their history and cited it. The revolt of 1381 was a reference point in the political arguments of the 1640s in ways that demonstrated its persistent presence in the tradition of English popular politics. The Chartist movement of the 19th century, which campaigned for democratic political representation, for working people through mass petitions and organised popular pressure, was operating in a direct line from the tradition of popular political mobilisation that 1381 had pioneered. The specific demands were completely different voting rights rather than the abolition of serfdom, but the logic of ordinary people organising collectively to present political demands to those who held power over their lives was precisely the logic that the rebels of 1381 had enacted. Whether the Chartist leaders consciously traced their lineage to the men and women of Essex and Kent is less important than the fact that the tradition was continuous in practical terms, transmitted not through formal historical education, but through the living memory of communities that passed down stories of organised resistance alongside their recipes and their occupational skills. The labour movement of the 19th and 20th centuries drew on the same tradition more explicitly. When trade unions in Victorian England argued for the right of workers to organise collectively, to negotiate their wages rather than accept what employers chose to offer, and to take collective action when individual action was insufficient to produce fair terms, they were making in institutional form the argument that the rebels of 1381 had made by marching on London. The specific legal instruments were different. The rhetorical framework was secular rather than theological. But the underlying claim that workers had a right to fair economic treatment that could be enforced through collective organisation rather than individual supplication was the same claim, translated across 5 centuries of social change into a form appropriate to the industrial rather than the agricultural context. John Ball would not have recognised a trade union as the form his argument would eventually take. He might, on reflection, have recognised the argument. The question of how 1381 fits into the broader arc of English and British history of rights and representation is one that historians have debated with varying conclusions. The maximalist version that 1381 was the direct ancestor of everything from parliamentary democracy to the welfare state is probably too neat. The minimalist version that it was a local crisis with no lasting consequences is demonstrably wrong. The honest answer lies somewhere in between. The revolt was one significant node in a long, discontinuous, non-linear development, in which ordinary people periodically organised to challenge the distribution of power and wealth, and in which those challenges both failed in their immediate objectives and succeeded in shifting the long-run terms of the argument. The specific legal changes demanded in 1381 were not implemented in 1381. But the argument that they were unjust, that the system denying freedom and suppressing wages and extracting poll taxes from people with no voice in the decision was wrong, that argument was not suppressed. It was preserved, circulated, modified, and eventually acted on in forms that the rebels would not entirely have recognised, but would probably have understood at the level of basic logic. The contemporary relevance of 1381 is not something that requires straining or special pleading to establish. The basic dynamics of the revolt economic inequality generating political pressure, legal mechanisms deployed to suppress that pressure rather than address it, a generation that has known partial improvement becoming more rather than less resistant to continued suppression, the gap between what the powerful say about justice and what they do in practice. These are not medieval peculiarities. They are recurring features of how societies work, and the specific form they took in 14th century England is one of the clearest and most thoroughly documented early examples in English history of the sequence by which they generate political crisis. The specifics change. The sequence is recognizable. What the rebels of 1381 understood that the system defining their lives was humanly constructed, and could therefore be humanly changed. That collective action by those with little individual power could move things that individual effort could not. That the moral argument for justice did not require the permission of the people profiting from injustice. These were not naive beliefs that events proved wrong. They were correct beliefs about how change happens, applied in a specific historical moment where the conditions for immediate success were not quite present. The conditions were closer than the revolt's defeat suggests. The near success of the movement, the genuine terror it produced in the ruling class, the speed with which the charters were revoked and the revolt was suppressed, all indicate how close the rebels came to achieving something permanent. A different outcome at Smithfield, a different decision about the Mile End charters, and the history of English serfdom might have ended not with a whimper of quiet commutation, but with the kind of formal emancipation that later generations would have remembered and celebrated. It did not work out that way. But the difference between what happened and what might have happened was not in the quality of the attempt. The people of the Essex villages and the Kentish roads who marched in June 1381 were not marching toward a future they could clearly see. They were marching away from a past they knew was wrong, and toward a set of demands that they had worked out carefully enough to put in writing and present to a king. The demands were refused, and the people who made them paid for it. But the ideas outlasted the people, and the world those ideas described a world in which the labour of ordinary people was valued rather than legally suppressed, in which freedom of movement was a right rather than a privilege, in which the law applied to the powerful as well as the powerless eventually arrived. It arrived slowly, unevenly, incompletely, through a long process of struggle that involved many more moments of failure than success, but it arrived. And one of the places where it started was a summer's march from the villages of Essex to the streets of London in the year 1381. That is enough history for tonight. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the people in it as people, rather than just names in a document, or if you saw something in 14th century England that looked familiar from considerably closer up, then the point of telling it has been made. The past is not a foreign country. It is, uncomfortably often, a reflection. Sleep well, and sweet dreams to everyone watching, wherever in the world you are.